When single father Evan Cruz dove into the churning Pacific waters that Tuesday morning, he thought he was saving just another swimmer caught in the riptide. The woman, floating face down in the foam, looked like any other beachgoer who'd misjudged the ocean's power. He'd performed countless rescues in his 8 years as a lifeguard, but this one would change everything. The unconscious woman he pulled from the waves and breathed life back into was Judge Althea Reyes, the same judge who held his daughter's future in her hands. The same judge who'd been denying his custody petitions for months, viewing him as just another struggling single parent. Now, as she lay recovering in the hospital bed, their eyes met with a recognition that would shake both their worlds. How do you thank someone for saving your life when you've been systematically dismantling theirs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt air carried the scent of freedom every morning at 5:30 when Evan Cruz unlocked the lifeguard station at Sunset Beach. He'd been making this walk for 8 years now, crossing the sand in the pre-dawn darkness, setting up equipment and checking conditions before the first joggers appeared on the horizon. The routine had become more than just a job. It was his meditation, his connection to something larger than the chaos that had consumed his personal life. At 34, Evan possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of countless hours under the California sun. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, a gift from 3 years of legal battles that had drained both his bank account and his faith in the system. The lines around his brown eyes came from squinting against ocean glare, but also from the weight of raising a 7-year-old daughter alone while fighting for the right to keep doing so. Maya Cruz was everything good that had ever happened to him. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn determination, creating a combination that could melt hearts and test patience in equal measure. Every morning before school, she would ride her pink bicycle to the lifeguard station, her backpack bouncing as she navigated the sandy path with the confidence of a child who had grown up by the ocean. "Morning, Daddy," she would call out, parking her bike next to the equipment shed. "Any rescues yet?" "Not yet, mija," he would reply, using the Spanish endearment his grandmother had taught him. "But the day is young." Maya had been asking that question since she was 4, old enough to understand that her father's job involved helping people in trouble. She took pride in his work, often telling her classmates that her daddy was a hero who saved people from drowning. The innocence in her voice always made Evan's chest tighten with equal parts love and worry. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that being a hero wasn't enough to keep them together? The custody battle had begun 2 years ago, when Carmen, his ex-wife, had resurfaced after abandoning them both. She'd left when Maya was 3, unable to handle the responsibilities of motherhood and marriage. For 2 years, Evan had heard nothing, no calls, no visits, no child support. He'd rebuilt their lives from scratch, creating a world where Maya felt safe and loved, despite her mother's absence. Then Carmen had returned with a new boyfriend, a new attitude, and a new lawyer. Suddenly, she wanted custody of the daughter she'd abandoned. Her argument was simple. A single father working as a lifeguard couldn't provide the stability a child needed. She had a college degree, a corporate job, and a partner who could offer Maya a proper family structure. The manila folder sitting on Evan's desk at home contained over 300 pages of legal documents, each one representing another defeat in Judge Althea Reyes' courtroom. The folder had grown thicker with each hearing, filled with Carmen's lawyer's arguments about inadequate housing, insufficient income, and the inherent instability of single-parent households. Judge Reyes had listened to it all with the expression of someone who had heard similar arguments 1,000 times before. She was known throughout the family court system as fair but rigid, a woman who followed the letter of the law with unwavering precision. Her reputation preceded her into every courtroom, Judge Ice, some lawyers called her, though never to her face. At 52, Althea Reyes had been on the bench for 15 years, handling some of the most contentious custody cases in the county. She had silver hair that she wore in a severe bun, steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that could silence a room with a single word. She dressed in dark suits, even outside the courtroom, as if she carried the weight of judicial authority wherever she went. Evan had appeared before her 4 times in the past 18 months. Each time, he'd hoped that she might see past the statistics and legal arguments to the reality of his life with Maya. Each time, he'd left feeling like he'd been measured against some invisible standard and found wanting. The first hearing had been about living arrangements. Carmen's lawyer had argued that Evan's small apartment near the beach was inadequate for a growing child. Judge Reyes had noted that while the apartment was clean and well-maintained, it was indeed small, and Maya's bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and dresser. She'd ordered a 6-month review to see if Evan could improve his housing situation. The second hearing had focused on income stability. Carmen's lawyer had presented charts showing the seasonal nature of lifeguard work, the lack of benefits, and the modest salary. Judge Reyes had acknowledged Evan's perfect attendance record and the respect he commanded from his supervisors, but she'd also noted that financial security was crucial for a child's welfare. Another 6-month review. The third hearing had been about social environment. Carmen's lawyer had painted a picture of Maya spending her days at the beach, exposed to transient populations and inappropriate influences. Judge Reyes had seemed skeptical of these claims, but she'd still ordered a social worker evaluation and psychological assessment for Maya. The fourth hearing had been the worst. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the court-appointed psychologist, had testified that Maya was a well-adjusted, happy child who showed no signs of trauma or neglect. She'd spoken about the strong bond between father and daughter, Maya's excellent academic performance, and her social development. For a moment, Evan had thought he might finally have a victory. But Carmen's lawyer had been prepared. He'd presented testimony from Maya's pediatrician about a missed vaccination appointment, from her school about a late pickup due to an emergency at the beach, and from a neighbor about noise complaints during one of Maya's birthday parties. None of it was serious, but together it painted a picture of a father who was stretched too thin to properly care for his daughter. Judge Reyes had listened to it all with her characteristic impassiveness. At the end of the hearing, she'd announced that she needed more time to review the evidence. That had been 3 weeks ago, and Evan had been living in limbo ever since, waiting for a decision that would determine whether he got to keep raising his daughter. The beach community had rallied around him. His fellow lifeguards had offered to testify about his character and work ethic. The local restaurant owners, where he was a regular customer, had written letters of support. Maya's teacher had submitted a glowing report about her academic progress and social development. Even the parents of Maya's friends had offered their endorsement. But none of it seemed to matter in Judge Reyes' courtroom. She dealt in facts, not feelings. She considered evidence, not emotions. She made decisions based on legal precedent, not personal testimony. And by every legal standard Carmen's lawyer had presented, Evan was falling short. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days saving people from drowning while feeling like he was drowning himself. Every morning, he'd scan the ocean for signs of trouble, ready to spring into action at the first indication that someone needed help. But when it came to his own life, he felt powerless against the legal current that seemed determined to pull Maya away from him. He'd considered giving up the fight more than once. Carmen had offered him generous visitation, rights every other weekend, holidays, and a month in the summer. Many divorced fathers would have been grateful for such an arrangement. But Evan wasn't like most divorced fathers. He'd been Maya's primary caregiver since she was born, the one who'd walked the floors with her when she was colicky, who'd taught her to ride her bike, who'd helped her with homework and kissed her scraped knees. More than that, he'd been the one who'd stayed. When Carmen had decided that motherhood was too difficult, too demanding, too limiting, Evan had stepped up to fill both roles. He'd learned to braid hair and paint fingernails, to navigate the complexities of little girl friendships and the mysteries of children's fashion. He'd become not just a father, but a parent in the fullest sense of the word. The thought of losing Maya wasn't just heartbreaking, it was incomprehensible. She was his anchor, his purpose, his reason for getting up every morning. Without her, he would just be another middle-aged man with a modest job and a small apartment. With her, he was everything he'd ever wanted to be. But wanting something and being able to keep it were two different things, as Judge Reyes had made abundantly clear. The law was not concerned with emotional bonds or good intentions. It was concerned with measurable outcomes and quantifiable benefits. And by those standards, Carmen's offer of a traditional two-parent household with greater financial resources was objectively better than what Evan could provide. The morning sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink when Evan finished his equipment check and raised the flags that indicated safe swimming conditions. The beach was still mostly empty, populated only by the dedicated early risers who came to run or walk before the day's heat set in. In a few hours, it would be crowded with families, couples, and groups of friends seeking respite from the inland heat. He'd made peace with his role as protector of this small stretch of coastline. It was good work, meaningful work, even if it didn't pay enough to impress family court judges. Every life he'd saved over the years had reinforced his belief that some things mattered more than money or status. Sometimes, being in the right place at the right time was enough to change everything. He had no way of knowing that Tuesday morning would prove that belief in ways he never could have imagined. He had no way of knowing that the woman who would soon be fighting for her life in the churning waters before him was the same woman who held his daughter's future in her hands. He had no way of knowing that his next rescue would save more than just a life, it would save everything that mattered to him. The ocean was restless that morning, stirred by a distant storm that wouldn't reach the coast for another day. The waves were larger than usual and the undertow was stronger. Evan made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the water, especially when the crowds arrived. Days like this were when people got into trouble, when the ocean reminded everyone that it was not to be taken lightly. He was adjusting the umbrella over his chair when he spotted her, a lone figure walking along the water's edge, her business attire incongruous against the casual beach setting. Even from a distance, he could see that she was overdressed for the early morning heat, wearing a dark suit that belonged in a boardroom, not on a beach. Judge Althea Reyes had been walking the shoreline for 20 minutes, her expensive shoes filling with sand as she tried to clear her head before another day of difficult decisions. She'd been having trouble sleeping lately, plagued by dreams of the courtroom and the faces of the families whose lives she'd forever altered with her rulings. The beach had seemed like a peaceful place to think, to find some clarity before facing another day of impossible choices. She'd been so lost in thought that she hadn't noticed how far she'd walked from the main beach area, hadn't realized that the waves were getting larger and more aggressive. When she finally looked up, she was alone on a stretch of sand that curved away from the populated areas, with only the ocean for company. The wave that knocked her down came from nowhere, a rogue swell that crashed over her knees and sent her tumbling backward into the surf. She tried to stand, but the undertow was stronger than she'd expected, pulling her feet out from under her and dragging her deeper into the churning water. Judge Reyes was not a strong swimmer. She'd grown up in the desert, far from any body of water larger than a swimming pool. The ocean was foreign territory, and as the current pulled her further from shore, she felt the first cold fingers of panic grip her chest. From his perch in the lifeguard chair, Evan saw her go down. Years of training kicked in, automatically grabbed the rescue buoy, signal for backup, enter the water at the safest point. He moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before, his mind already calculating angles and currents as he sprinted toward the surf. The rescue itself was textbook perfect. Evan reached Judge Reyes just as she was losing her fight against the undertow, managed to get the buoy around her chest, and used his superior strength and swimming ability to fight their way back to shore. He'd performed CPR on the sand, breathing life back into her unconscious form while waiting for the paramedics to arrive. It was only later, in the hospital, when Judge Reyes opened her eyes and looked into the face of her rescuer, that the full magnitude of what had happened became clear. The man who had saved her life was Evan Cruz, the single father whose custody case she'd been deliberating for weeks. The man whose parental rights she'd been preparing to terminate was the same man who'd risked his own life to save hers. The manila folder full of legal documents suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the reality of the man who sat beside her hospital bed, concerned and gentle, asking if she was okay and if there was anyone he could call for her. This was not the inadequate father Carmen's lawyer had described. This was a man who saved lives without thinking, who put others' welfare before his own, who embodied the very qualities she'd been told he lacked. Judge Reyes closed her eyes and tried to process the implications of what had happened. In her 15 years on the bench, she'd never faced anything like this. The ethical considerations alone were staggering. She would have to recuse herself from the case, of course. But beyond the legal complications, she was confronting something more personal and more troubling, the possibility that she'd been wrong about Evan Cruz from the very beginning. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor reminded Judge Althea Reyes of every difficult decision she'd ever made. She'd spent enough time in hospitals over the years, visiting victims of domestic violence, reviewing medical records in custody cases, making determinations about children's welfare based on doctors' reports. But she'd never been the patient before, never been the one lying vulnerable in a narrow bed with monitors beeping around her. The hospital bracelet around her wrist felt foreign against her skin. Reyes, Althea M. It read, followed by her date of birth and a series of numbers that reduced her to a case file. For someone accustomed to being addressed as Your Honor, the sudden anonymity was unsettling. Here, she was just another patient who'd underestimated the ocean's power. She'd been awake for 2 hours, but the memories of the morning were still fragmented. She remembered walking on the beach, trying to clear her head before another day of court. She remembered the wave that knocked her down, the sudden panic as the current pulled her away from shore. Everything after that was hazy, until she'd opened her eyes to find a familiar face looking down at her with concern. Evan Cruz. Even in her disoriented state, she'd recognized him immediately. The same dark eyes that had looked at her pleadingly from across the courtroom, the same weathered hands that had held legal documents while his lawyer made arguments for his parental rights. But instead of the barely contained desperation she'd seen in court, his expression now held only genuine worry for her well-being. The irony was almost too much to process. The man whose fitness as a parent she'd been questioning was the same man who'd risked his life to save hers. The father she'd been preparing to declare inadequate had proven himself capable of extraordinary selflessness and courage. Everything she thought she knew about Evan Cruz was suddenly called into question. Dr. Patricia Kim, the attending physician, had explained the medical facts with professional clarity. Near drowning, water in the lungs, mild hypothermia. Evan's quick response and CPR had prevented serious brain damage or worse. She was lucky to be alive, the doctor had said, and she had her rescuer to thank for that. He stayed until he knew you were stable. Dr. Kim had added, wouldn't leave until we assured him you were going to be okay. Most people would have handed you off to the paramedics and gone back to work. But Evan Cruz wasn't most people, a fact that was becoming increasingly clear to Judge Reyes as she lay in the hospital bed, confronting the reality of what had happened. She'd spent months reviewing evidence about his character, his fitness as a parent, his ability to provide for his daughter. Carmen's lawyer had painted him as irresponsible, financially unstable, emotionally unreliable. Yet when a stranger's life was in danger, he'd acted without hesitation, risking everything to save someone he didn't even know. The knock on her door came at 3 in the afternoon. She'd been expecting hospital protocol required rescue victims to be checked on by their rescuers, and she'd been told that Evan had asked permission to visit. Still, when he appeared in the doorway, she felt an uncomfortable mix of gratitude and embarrassment. He looked different outside the courtroom. Gone was the ill-fitting suit he wore to hearings, replaced by his lifeguard uniformed shorts, white polo shirt with the city logo, a whistle hanging around his neck. His hair was still damp from the ocean, and there was sand on his sneakers. He looked like what he was, a working man who'd interrupted his day to save a life. "Judge Reyes," he said quietly, stepping just inside the room. "I wanted to check on you, see how you were feeling." The formality in his voice reminded her of their previous interactions, but the concern in his eyes was entirely new. In the courtroom, he'd always seemed guarded, defensive, as if he expected her to find fault with everything he said. Now, he simply looked like a decent man who'd done what needed to be done. "I'm alive because of you," she said, her voice still rough from the seawater she'd inhaled. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." Evan shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped behind his back. "You don't need to thank me. It's what anyone would have done." But they both knew that wasn't true. Judge Reyes had seen enough of human nature to know that not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. She'd presided over cases where parents had failed to protect their own children, where people had looked the other way when intervention was needed. What Evan had done was not what anyone would have done, it was what a hero would do. "I have to ask," she said carefully, "did you know who I was when you pulled me out?" Evan shook his head. "Not until you opened your eyes here in the hospital. You looked different." He gestured vaguely at her hospital gown and disheveled hair. "I mean, you weren't in your usual courtroom attire." The comment brought a small, unexpected smile to her lips. She tried to imagine how she must have looked to him, the stern judge who'd been ruling against him for months, reduced to a helpless victim in a hospital bed. The role reversal was complete and humbling. "This changes things," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "Changes what?" Evan asked, though she could see in his expression that he already knew. "I'll have to recuse myself from your case. There's no way I can remain impartial after this." She gestured between them, encompassing the hospital room and everything that had brought them here. "My decision about Maya's custody will have to be made by another judge." Evan was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Judge Martinez?" he asked finally. "Most likely." Judge Reyes knew her colleague well. Robert Martinez was fair but conservative, traditional in his views about family structure. Carmen's case for custody might actually be stronger before him than it had been before her. The thought brought an unexpected pang of something that felt suspiciously like regret. "Will this hurt your career?" Evan asked, surprising her with the question. "Having to step down from a case?" The concern in his voice was genuine, and Judge Reyes found herself moved by it. Here was a man whose entire future hung in the balance, whose daughter's welfare depended on the outcome of a custody battle, and he was worried about how the situation might affect her professional standing. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never faced anything like this before. The Judicial Ethics Committee will have to review the situation." Evan stepped closer to her bed, his expression troubled. "I don't want you to get in trouble because you saved my life. That's not right." "You saved my life," she corrected gently, "and you're not responsible for the complications that creates." But even as she said it, Judge Reyes knew that the complications were just beginning. The local news had already picked up the story lifeguard saves drowning woman, and it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. When they did, the media attention would be intense and potentially damaging for both of them. Her phone had been buzzing all afternoon with calls from the court administrator, her law clerk, and several judicial colleagues. Word was spreading through the legal community that Judge Reyes had been involved in some kind of incident. Soon, everyone would know the full story. "There's something else," Evan said, his voice hesitant. "My lawyer called. The media is starting to ask questions about the rescue, about who you are and what your connection is to me. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Judge Reyes closed her eyes and felt the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. In her 15 years on the bench, she'd managed to avoid any hint of scandal or impropriety. She'd built her reputation on being above reproach, beyond question. Now, through no fault of her own, she was at the center of a story that would raise eyebrows throughout the legal community. "What will you tell them?" she asked. "The truth," Evan said simply. "That you were drowning and I pulled you out. That's all there is to it." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. The truth was that a family court judge had been rescued by a man whose parental rights she'd been about to rule on. The truth was that their professional relationship had been permanently altered by an act of heroism that neither of them had seen coming. The truth was that everything had changed in the space of a single morning. "I should go," Evan said after a moment of silence. "Let you rest, but if you need anything, if there's anyone I can call for you." "There's no one," Judge Reyes said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The admission surprised her with its honesty. She had colleagues, of course, and professional acquaintances, but no family, no close friends, no one who would drop everything to sit by her hospital bed. Evan's expression softened at her words. "What about when you're discharged? Do you have someone to drive you home?" "I'll call a taxi," she said, but he was already shaking his head. "I could drive you. I mean, if you're comfortable with that. I know it's—" He gestured vaguely, acknowledging the strangeness of the situation. "That's very kind," Judge Reyes said carefully, "but I think it would be better if we kept our interactions minimal, given the circumstances." Evan nodded, though she could see disappointment in his eyes. "Of course, I understand." But as he turned to leave, Judge Reyes found herself speaking again. "Evan?" He stopped and looked back at her. "For what it's worth, I want you to know that I never took your case lightly. I know it doesn't seem that way, but every decision I made was based on what I thought was best for Maya." "I know," he said quietly. "I may not have agreed with your rulings, but I never doubted that you were trying to do the right thing." After he left, Judge Reyes lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the space of a few hours, her carefully ordered world had been turned upside down. The case that had been weighing on her mind for weeks was no longer her responsibility. The man she'd been prepared to rule against had proven himself capable of extraordinary courage and selflessness. More troubling was the growing realization that she might have been wrong about him from the beginning. The evidence presented in court had painted a picture of an inadequate father, but evidence could be selective, incomplete, misleading. What she'd witnessed today, Evan's immediate response to danger, his genuine concern for her welfare, his willingness to put her needs before his own interests, suggested a character that was fundamentally different from what she'd been led to believe. The hospital bracelet around her wrist caught the afternoon light, reminding her of her temporary vulnerability. Tomorrow, she would be discharged and would have to face the consequences of what had happened. She would have to explain to her colleagues why she was recusing herself from a high-profile case. She would have to endure the media attention and the questions about her judgment and objectivity. But tonight, alone in the hospital room with only her thoughts for company, Judge Reyes allowed herself to confront a more uncomfortable truth. She was beginning to wonder if she'd been wrong about more than just Evan Cruz. Maybe she'd been wrong about the nature of justice itself, about the difference between following the law and doing what was right. The evening news would later report that a family court judge had been rescued from drowning by a local lifeguard. The story would mention that both parties declined to comment, that the judge was in stable condition, and that an investigation into the incident was ongoing. What the news wouldn't report was the quiet revolution taking place in Judge Reyes's understanding of the man whose life she'd been about to change forever. By morning, she would have to call the court administrator and formally request to be removed from Cruz v. Cruz. She would have to draft a statement explaining her decision and prepare for the ethical review that would inevitably follow. She would have to figure out how to rebuild her reputation in the aftermath of an incident that was already beyond her control. But for now, she simply lay in the hospital bed and thought about the look in Evan Cruz's eyes when he'd asked if she was okay. It was the look of someone who cared about others without calculation, someone who acted on instinct and conscience rather than self-interest. It was the look of a man who would make a good father if anyone bothered to look past the statistics and see the person underneath. Judge Reyes closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to one inescapable fact. The man she'd been preparing to separate from his daughter had just saved her life. The irony was almost too much to bear, but it was nothing compared to the growing certainty that she'd been about to make a terrible mistake. Judge Reyes's resignation letter from the Cruz custody case sat half-finished on her home computer screen, the cursor blinking after the words, "Due to unforeseen circumstances that compromise my ability to remain impartial." She'd been staring at the sentence for 20 minutes, unable to find the right way to explain what had happened without making it sound like either a fairy tale or a scandal. The morning news had been mercifully brief in its coverage of the rescue, focusing more on beach safety and lifeguard training than on the personal details of those involved. But Judge Reyes knew it was only a matter of time before someone in the legal community connected the dots and realized the full implications of the story. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. First, her clerk Patricia had called to inform her that the court administrator wanted to speak with her urgently. Then Judge Martinez had called, ostensibly to check on her health, but really to satisfy his curiosity about the incident. Finally, Carmen Rivera's attorney, David Thornton, had left a voicemail demanding to know if there was any truth to the rumors circulating about his client's case. She deleted Thornton's message without listening to it completely. The man's aggressive tactics in the courtroom had always rubbed her the wrong way, and she had no intention of discussing case details with him outside of proper channels. Whatever happened next with the Cruz custody case would be handled according to protocol, not in response to pressure from either side. The draft resignation letter stared back at her from the screen, demanding completion. How do you explain that saving someone's life changes everything, even when it shouldn't? How do you convey that seeing someone's true character in a moment of crisis makes all previous judgments suspect? How do you admit that you might have been wrong about something as fundamental as a parent's fitness to raise their child? 3 miles away, Evan Cruz was having his own morning crisis. Maya sat at their small kitchen table, methodically eating her cereal while eyeing her father with the uncanny perception that 7-year-olds possess when they sense something is wrong with their world. "You look worried, Daddy," she said between spoonfuls of Cheerios. "Are you sad about something?" Evan tried to arrange his features into a reassuring expression, but Maya had always been able to see through his attempts at hiding his emotions. It was both a blessing and a curse to have a daughter who understood him so well. "Just grown-up stuff, mija," he said, refilling her orange juice glass. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Maya's expression suggested she wasn't buying his reassurance. "Is it about the lady you saved yesterday? The one on the news?" Evan nearly dropped the juice pitcher. He'd hoped Maya hadn't seen the brief news report, but apparently his daughter was more observant than he'd given her credit for. "You saw that? Mrs. Rodriguez next door was watching the news when I went to get my ball from her yard. She said my daddy was a hero." Maya's voice carried the kind of pride that made Evan's chest tighten with love and worry in equal measure. "But you look sad about it." How could he explain to a 7-year-old that being a hero sometimes created more problems than it solved? How could he tell her that the woman he'd saved was the same woman who held the power to take her away from him? How could he burden a child with the knowledge that their future together hung in the balance of forces beyond either of their control? "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about things," he said finally, sitting down across from her at the table. "I'm glad I could help that lady, but it might change some other things in our lives." Maya considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. "Good changes or bad changes?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart. We'll have to wait and see." The phone rang before Maya could ask any more questions, providing Evan with a temporary reprieve from her uncomfortable perceptiveness. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, was calling with news that was both expected and troubling. "Judge Reyes is formally recusing herself from your case," Sarah reported without preamble. "The court administrator just called. They're reassigning you to Judge Martinez." Evan felt his stomach drop. He'd been hoping that Judge Reyes might find a way to remain on the case, despite the obvious ethical complications. Judge Martinez was known for his traditional views on family structure, his belief that children needed 2-parent households whenever possible. Carmen's case for custody would likely be stronger before him than it had been before Judge Reyes. "When's the new hearing scheduled?" he asked, glancing at Maya to make sure she was still focused on her breakfast rather than his conversation. 3 weeks from today. Martinez wants to review all the case files first, which means we're essentially starting over with our arguments. Starting over. The phrase hit Evan like a physical blow. 18 months of legal proceedings, thousands of dollars in attorney fees, countless hours of testimony and documentation. All of it would have to be presented again to a new judge who would bring his own biases and preconceptions to the case. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," he said, lowering his voice. "Do you think what happened yesterday helps us or hurts us?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Honestly, I don't know. On one hand, it demonstrates your character and your instinct to protect others. On the other hand, it raises questions about why Judge Reyes was considering ruling against you in the first place. Martinez might wonder if there was something in her evaluation that he should be concerned about." After hanging up, Evan sat at the kitchen table and watched his daughter finish her breakfast. Maya was humming quietly to herself, a sure sign that she was content with her world. The sound broke his heart, knowing that her innocent happiness might soon be shattered by forces she couldn't understand or control. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Martinez was reviewing the crew's case files with the methodical attention he brought to all his assignments. Robert Martinez had been on the family court bench for 12 years, and he prided himself on making decisions based on clear legal precedent rather than emotional appeal. Children, in his view, needed stability above all else, and stability was most often found in traditional two-parent households with adequate financial resources. The crew's case presented what seemed like a straightforward custody determination. A mother who had left when the child was young but had since established herself professionally was seeking to regain custody from a father whose resources and living situation were marginal at best. The psychological evaluation of the child was positive, but Martinez had seen enough cases to know that children could appear well-adjusted, even in inadequate circumstances. What puzzled him was Judge Reyes's apparent reluctance to make a decision. The case had been on her docket for months, with multiple continuances and extensions. Althea Reyes was known for her efficiency and decisiveness. She typically resolved custody cases much more quickly than this. The fact that she'd been deliberating for so long suggested either unusual complexity in the case or unusual uncertainty about the appropriate resolution. Now, with her recusal due to the rescue incident, Martinez would have to make the determination himself. He'd already scheduled meetings with both attorneys to discuss their positions and review the evidence. Carmen Rivera's lawyer had been particularly eager to present what he called new developments in the case. David Thornton arrived at Martinez's chambers precisely on time, carrying a briefcase full of updated documentation and a confidence that bordered on smugness. He'd been practicing family law for 15 years, and he knew how to present his clients in the most favorable light possible. "Your Honor," Thornton began, settling into the chair across from Martinez's desk, "I want to thank you for taking on this case. I believe you'll find that the evidence strongly supports my client's petition for custody." Martinez nodded noncommittally. "I've reviewed the basic case files, but I'd like to hear your summary of the key issues." "Certainly. Mrs. Rivera acknowledges that she made a mistake by leaving when Maya was young. But people change, Your Honor, and she's worked hard to establish herself as a responsible adult with the resources to provide a stable home for her daughter." Thornton opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. "She has a steady job as a marketing coordinator with a healthcare company, health insurance, a 2-bedroom apartment in a good school district, and a long-term relationship with a man who's eager to be a positive male role model for Maya." "And Mr. Cruz's situation?" Martinez asked, though he'd already read the relevant documents. "Mr. Cruz is a single man working a seasonal job with no benefits and marginal pay. He lives in a 1-bedroom apartment near the Beacon area known for transient populations and tourist-related disruptions. While he appears to love his daughter, love alone isn't sufficient to provide the stability a child needs." Martinez made notes as Thornton spoke, though he was careful not to reveal his own thoughts about the case. The psychological evaluation of the child was positive. "Yes, but children are remarkably adaptable, Your Honor. Just because Maya has adjusted to her current situation doesn't mean it's the best possible situation for her. Mrs. Rivera can offer her a traditional family structure, better educational opportunities, and long-term financial security." After Thornton left, Martinez sat in his chambers and reviewed the case materials more carefully. On paper, Carmen Rivera's petition for custody seemed reasonable. She'd made mistakes in the past, but she'd apparently learned from them and was now in a position to provide a stable home for her daughter. Evan Cruz, despite his obvious devotion to Maya, was struggling financially and living in circumstances that were less than ideal for a growing child. But something about the case bothered Martinez, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the dramatic nature of Carmen's abandonment and return, or the length of time Judge Reyes had taken to make her decision. Perhaps it was the coincidence of the rescue incident, which had thrust both parties into an uncomfortable spotlight. Whatever it was, Martinez decided he wanted to review the case thoroughly before making any preliminary judgments. He scheduled meetings with both attorneys, ordered new psychological evaluations for all parties involved, and requested updated financial statements from both parents. Back at the beach, Evan was trying to focus on his work while processing the implications of starting over with a new judge. The morning had been busy with early swimmers and joggers, but the rescue from the previous day had changed something fundamental about how people looked at him. Instead of simply nodding and moving on, beachgoers were stopping to talk, thanking him for his service, treating him like a local celebrity. The attention made him uncomfortable. He'd always preferred to do his job quietly and professionally, without fanfare or recognition. Being called a hero felt presumptuous, especially when he knew that any of his fellow lifeguards would have done the same thing. Saving lives was part of the job description, not an extraordinary act worthy of special praise. But the praise kept coming. The beach patrol supervisor had called to commend him for his quick response and professional handling of the situation. The mayor's office had left a message about presenting him with a commendation. Local news stations were requesting interviews about beach safety and lifeguard training. All of the attention felt surreal when measured against the reality of his situation. Tomorrow, he would meet with his lawyer to prepare for yet another custody hearing. Tomorrow, he would have to explain to Maya why they might be spending less time together in the coming months. Tomorrow, he would have to face the possibility that being a hero wasn't enough to keep his daughter. The irony was inescapable. He'd saved a stranger's life and become a local hero, but he might still lose the most important thing in his own life. Judge Reyes's recusal meant that everything was starting over, and there was no guarantee that the next judge would see past the legal arguments to the reality of his relationship with Maya. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the beach, Evan found himself thinking about the moment when Judge Reyes had opened her eyes in the hospital. The recognition in her expression had been immediate and complex gratitude mixed with surprise, professionalism, complicated by personal connection. For just a moment, she'd looked at him not as a case file or a legal problem, but as a human being who'd risked everything to save her life. He wondered if that moment of recognition might have changed her perspective on his fitness as a father. He wondered if she might have ruled differently on his custody case, if she'd remained as the presiding judge. But wondering was pointless now. Judge Reyes was no longer part of his legal future, and Judge Martinez would make his own determinations based on his own understanding of the evidence. The only thing Evan could do was continue being the best father he knew how to be and hope that someone, somewhere in the legal system, would recognize that love and dedication mattered more than income statements and living arrangements. The ocean had taught him that sometimes the most important rescues were the ones that looked impossible from the shore. Maya's drawing covered the entire kitchen table when Evan arrived home from work that evening. She'd used every crayon in her box to create what could only be described as a masterpiece of 7-year-old imagination. Her father depicted as a superhero, complete with a red cape and a lifeguard whistle, pulling a woman from bright blue waves while the sun smiled down from a yellow sky. "It's you saving the lady, Daddy," Maya announced proudly, adding final touches to the woman's dark hair. "Mrs. Patterson at school said you're a real hero, so I drew you like Superman, but better because you're real." Evan stood in the doorway, his work bag sliding from his shoulder as he took in the detailed artwork. Maya had even included their small apartment building in the background, with tiny flowers growing outside their window and her pink bicycle parked by the front door. It was their life, as seen through the eyes of a child who believed her father could do anything, save drowning women, fight bad guys, make everything okay. "It's beautiful, Mija," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You're quite an artist." Maya beamed at the praise, then returned to her coloring with the focused intensity she brought to all her creative projects. "I want to give it to the lady you saved, to say thank you for letting you be a hero." The innocence of the gesture hit Evan like a physical blow. Maya had no idea that the lady in her drawing was the same person who'd been preparing to take her away from him. She had no understanding of the legal complications or ethical concerns that had forced Judge Reyes to step down from their case. In Maya's world, her father had done something wonderful, and the appropriate response was to share that joy with everyone involved. "That's very thoughtful of you," Evan said carefully, "but I'm not sure when we'll see her again. Can't we visit her, like when I was in the hospital with my appendix and all my friends came to see me?" The memory of Maya's appendectomy 6 months earlier brought its own complications. Carmen had been notified, of course, but she'd been in Phoenix on a business trip and couldn't get away immediately. Evan had spent 3 days at Maya's bedside, taking vacation time from work and sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair. When Carmen finally arrived, she'd stayed for 2 hours before returning to her hotel, claiming she needed to prepare for an important presentation. The incident had been another mark against him in Carmen's custody petition. Her lawyer had argued that a single parent couldn't provide adequate support during medical emergencies, that Maya needed the stability of a 2-parent household to ensure her welfare in crisis situations. The fact that Evan had handled the emergency competently and lovingly seemed less important than the theoretical advantages of having 2 parents available. "Hospitals are different from visiting people at their homes," Evan explained to Maya. "Judge, the lady I helped, she's probably resting and doesn't want visitors right now." Maya nodded solemnly, accepting his explanation without argument. At 7, she still trusted that her father knew best about such things. But Evan could see the disappointment in her eyes, the desire to share her artistic tribute with someone who would appreciate its significance. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Evan found himself studying her, drawing more carefully. She'd captured something in her childish rendering that the adult world seemed determined to overlook. The simple truth that helping others was good, that saving someone's life was heroic, that doing the right thing mattered more than rules and regulations. The woman in Maya's drawing looked peaceful, grateful, safe in the arms of her superhero father. There was no hint of legal complications or ethical dilemmas, no suggestion that this act of heroism might actually complicate their lives rather than improve them. Maya's version of events was pure and uncomplicated. Daddy saved someone, everyone should be happy. The phone rang at 9:30, interrupting Evan's contemplation of his daughter's artwork. Sarah Chen's voice was tense when he answered, carrying news that he'd been dreading since Judge Reyes's recusal. Carmen's lawyer filed a motion to expedite the custody hearing, Sarah reported. He's arguing that the media attention around the rescue incident creates an unstable environment for Maya and that immediate action is needed to protect her welfare. Evan felt his stomach clench. What kind of media attention? It was barely mentioned on the local news. Apparently someone leaked more details about the connection between you and Judge Reyes. There's a story running tomorrow in the legal newspaper about the ethical implications of the situation. Thornton is using it to argue that Maya is being exposed to unnecessary scrutiny and potential harassment. The legal newspaper. Evan had never heard of it, but apparently it was influential enough to cause problems for his case. What does this mean for our timeline? Judge Martinez granted the motion. We have a hearing next Friday instead of 3 weeks from now. That gives us 6 days to prepare our response to whatever new arguments Thornton is planning to present. After hanging up, Evan sat at the kitchen table and stared at Maya's drawing. The superhero version of himself looked confident and capable, ready to handle any challenge that came his way. But the real Evan felt overwhelmed by forces beyond his control, caught in a legal system that seemed designed to punish good intentions and complicate simple truths. Across town, Judge Reyes was dealing with her own complications from the rescue incident. The legal newspaper article that Thornton had referenced was lying open on her coffee table, its headline reading, "Family Court Judge, Rescued by Custody Case Defendant." Ethical questions mount. The reporter had done their homework, connecting all the relevant dots and raising questions about judicial impartiality, case management, and the appearance of impropriety. The article was fair but damaging, presenting the facts without editorializing, but letting the implications speak for themselves. Judge Reyes was described as a respected jurist with an impeccable record. But questions were raised about her handling of the Cruz case, the length of time she'd taken to make a decision, and whether her rescue by Evan had influenced her deliberations. Worse than the newspaper article was the call she'd received that afternoon from the Judicial Ethics Committee. A formal inquiry was being opened into her conduct, not because anyone believed she'd done anything wrong, but because the appearance of impropriety required investigation. She would have to submit detailed reports about her case management decisions, her interactions with both parties, and her reasons for the various continuances and delays. The inquiry wouldn't affect her ability to hear other cases, but it would be a permanent part of her judicial record. In a profession where reputation was everything, even an exoneration from the Ethics Committee would leave lingering questions about her judgment and objectivity. Judge Reyes had spent her entire career building a reputation for fairness and impartiality. She'd never had a ruling overturned on appeal, never faced an ethics complaint, never given anyone reason to question her professional conduct. Now, through no fault of her own, she was at the center of a controversy that threatened everything she'd worked to achieve. The irony was bitter. She'd been saved from drowning only to find herself drowning in ethical complications and professional scrutiny. Evan Cruz had preserved her life, but the act of preservation had put both of their futures at risk. She thought about the man who'd pulled her from the ocean, the quiet dignity he'd shown in visiting her at the hospital, his genuine concern for her welfare despite the awkwardness of their situation. The evidence presented in court had painted him as marginally adequate at best, but her personal interaction with him suggested something different. A man of character and integrity who deserved better than the legal system was giving him. But personal impressions weren't supposed to matter in judicial decisions. The law was designed to be objective, based on measurable criteria rather than subjective evaluations. The fact that she was questioning her previous assessment of Evan Cruz only proved that her judgment had been compromised by their personal connection. The next morning brought more complications. Maya's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, called Evan at work to report that other children were asking Maya about her father's rescue and whether it was true that he'd saved a judge. The questions were innocent enough, but they were clearly making Maya uncomfortable, and Mrs. Patterson was concerned about the potential for teasing or unwanted attention. "Maya's handling it well," Mrs. Patterson assured him, "but I thought you should know that word is spreading among the families. Some of the parents are asking me questions that I don't feel comfortable answering." Evan thanked her for the call and promised to talk to Maya about how to handle the situation. But as he hung up, he realized that his daughter was already paying the price for his moment of heroism. The simple act of saving someone's life had thrust both of them into a spotlight that neither of them wanted or deserved. Carmen arrived at Maya's school that afternoon, unannounced, a violation of the current custody arrangement that required advance notice for any contact during Evan's designated time. She was waiting in the principal's office when Maya emerged from her classroom, her presence as shocking to the 7-year-old as it was problematic for Evan's case. "Mommy!" Maya exclaimed, her confusion evident in her voice. Carmen looked different, more polished, more professional than Maya remembered. Her hair was shorter, styled in a way that suggested expensive salon visits. Her clothes were newer, more sophisticated. Even her smile seemed calculated, as if she'd practiced it in a mirror. "Hello, sweetheart," Carmen said, kneeling down to Maya's level. "I wanted to see how you were doing with all this excitement about your daddy." Maya glanced around uncertainly, looking for familiar faces. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, anyone who could explain why her mother was suddenly there when she wasn't supposed to be. "Daddy's at work," she said finally. "I know, baby. I wanted to talk to you about some things. About how it might be nice for you to spend more time with me, maybe live with me and my friend Mark for a while." The conversation was overheard by Mrs. Patterson, who immediately called the principal and then contacted Evan at the lifeguard station. By the time Evan arrived at the school, Carmen was gone, but the damage was done. Maya was confused and upset, asking questions about why her mother had suggested she might leave Daddy, whether she was in trouble, whether the rescue had somehow changed everything. "Nothing's going to change, Mija," Evan assured her, holding her close as they sat in the principal's office. "You're staying with me, just like always." But even as he spoke the words, Evan knew they might not be true. Carmen's impromptu visit was clearly part of a strategy to establish her presence in Maya's life before the custody hearing. The timing wasn't coincidental. She was using the media attention around the rescue to paint Evan as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose life was too chaotic for a child. That evening, Evan helped Maya finish her superhero drawing, adding small details that she requested. A rainbow over the ocean, seagulls in the sky, a small figure of Maya herself watching from the beach. When it was complete, she insisted on signing her name in careful 7-year-old letters at the bottom. "Can we really not give this to the lady?" Maya asked as Evan tucked her into bed. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes when grown-ups try to help each other, it creates problems that are hard to explain." Maya considered this with the seriousness she brought to all of life's mysteries. "But helping people is good, right? That's what you always tell me." "Yes," Evan said, smoothing her dark hair away from her face. "Helping people is always good. Sometimes it just makes other things more difficult. Like when I helped Jenny with her math and Mrs. Patterson said we were cheating." The comparison was apt, Evan realized. Maya had been trying to help a friend who was struggling, but the teacher had seen it as academic dishonesty. Good intentions didn't always lead to good outcomes, especially when rules and regulations were involved. "Something like that," he agreed. "But I want you to remember that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it causes problems." After Maya was asleep, Evan sat in his small living room and tried to process everything that had happened since the rescue. 2 days ago, his biggest worry had been Judge Reyes' pending decision on Maya's custody. Now he was facing an expedited hearing before a new judge, media scrutiny that was affecting his daughter's school experience, and Carmen's increasingly aggressive attempts to insert herself into Maya's daily life. The drawing was still on the kitchen table, Maya's cheerful superhero narrative mocking the complex reality of their situation. In her 7-year-old worldview, heroes saved people, and everyone lived happily ever after. She had no understanding of ethical dilemmas, legal complications, or the way that good intentions could be twisted into evidence of poor judgment. But looking at the drawing, Evan realized that Maya's perspective might be the most honest one of all. He had saved someone's life. That was a good thing, regardless of the complications it had created. Judge Reyes was alive because of his actions, and that mattered more than custody hearings or media attention or ethical inquiries. The challenge now was figuring out how to explain to a new judge that being a hero didn't disqualify him from being a good father. That saving someone's life demonstrated exactly the kind of character and judgment that Maya needed in a parent. that love and dedication mattered more than income statements and living arrangements. He thought about Judge Reyes's expression when she'd opened her eyes in the hospital, the recognition and gratitude he'd seen there. For just a moment, she'd seen him not as a case file, but as a human being. He wondered if Judge Martinez would be able to see past the legal arguments to the same truth, or if the superhero in Maya's drawing would remain nothing more than a child's fantasy. Dr. Rebecca Walsh's office was designed to be calming, with soft lighting, earth-tone furniture, and the kind of abstract artwork that was meant to be soothing rather than provocative. Judge Reyes sat in the oversized chair across from the therapist's desk, her hands folded in her lap, trying to reconcile her presence here with her image of herself as someone who had everything under control. The medical report from her near-drowning experience lay open between them, its clinical language unable to capture the psychological impact of what she'd endured. Acute stress reaction following near-death experience, it read. Patient reports intrusive thoughts, sleep disturbance, and difficulty concentrating. Recommend psychological evaluation and possible therapy to address trauma response. Tell me about the dreams, Dr. Walsh said gently, her voice carrying the professional warmth that came from 20 years of helping people navigate their darkest moments. Judge Reyes shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She'd never been in therapy before, had always prided herself on being able to handle whatever life threw at her through sheer determination and logical thinking. But the dreams that had been plaguing her sleep weren't responding to logic or willpower. I'm back in the water, she said finally, but this time there's no one coming to save me. I can see the shore, but it keeps getting farther away. And there are faces in the waves, all the families I've ruled on, all the children I've separated from their parents. Dr. Walsh made notes as Judge Reyes spoke, but her attention remained focused on her patient's face, reading the emotions that flickered across her normally composed features. In the dream, I try to call out to them, to explain my decisions, but the water fills my mouth every time I try to speak. They just watch me drowning, and I realize that none of them care enough to help me because of what I've done to their families. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond trauma recovery. Walsh had worked with judges before, knew the psychological toll that making life-altering decisions could take on even the most experienced jurists. How long have you been questioning your rulings? Dr. Walsh asked. I don't question my rulings, Judge Reyes replied automatically, then stopped herself. I didn't used to question them. They were based on the law, on the evidence presented, on established precedent. Personal feelings weren't supposed to factor into the decision-making process. But personal feelings are factoring in now? Judge Reyes was quiet for a long moment, staring at the abstract painting on the wall behind Dr. Walsh's head. It was all soft blues and greys, like water in motion, and she found herself thinking about the waves that had nearly claimed her life. The man who saved me, she said finally. I'd been hearing his custody case for months. Every piece of evidence suggested that he was marginally adequate as a parent at best. But when I was drowning, he didn't hesitate. He risked his own life to save someone he didn't even know. That's not the action of someone with poor judgment or inadequate character. Dr. Walsh nodded encouragingly. And that makes you question what? Everything. The word came out more forcefully than Judge Reyes had intended. If I was wrong about him, what else have I been wrong about? How many families have I destroyed because I was looking at statistics instead of seeing people? The question that had been haunting her since the hospital was finally spoken aloud, and Judge Reyes felt both relief and terror at having given voice to it. For 15 years, she'd based her identity on being an impartial arbiter of justice, someone who could set aside emotion and make difficult decisions based on objective criteria. Now she was confronting the possibility that objectivity itself might be a kind of blindness. Let's talk about the Cruz case specifically, Dr. Walsh suggested. What evidence led you to favor the mother's petition for custody? Judge Reyes recited the facts as they'd been presented. Carmen's education and stable employment, her new relationship that provided a two-parent household, her improved living situation in a better school district. Against that, Evan's modest income, small apartment, and single-parent status seemed inadequate by comparison. "But you delayed making a decision for several months," Dr. Walsh observed. "What was causing your hesitation?" The question struck at the heart of Judge Reyes' internal conflict. She told herself that she was being thorough, that complex custody cases required careful deliberation, but the truth was more complicated and more troubling. "The child," she admitted, "Maya. Every report about her was positive. She was thriving academically, socially, emotionally. The bond between her and her father was clearly strong. But the mother's abandonment when Maya was young there was something about that bothered me." "What specifically?" "Carmen Rivera left when her daughter was 3 years old. Not because of abuse or danger, but because she found motherhood too difficult. She stayed away for 2 years without any contact, then suddenly returned wanting custody when it was convenient for her new life situation." Judge Reyes realized she was revealing biases that she'd tried to keep buried during the legal proceedings. Personal experience wasn't supposed to influence judicial decisions, but her own childhood had been marked by a mother who'd chosen career advancement over family stability. "I kept thinking about what kind of person abandons a 3-year-old, she continued, and what kind of person stays and builds a life around that child despite the challenges. But the law doesn't consider emotional abandonment as much as it should. It focuses on current circumstances rather than past choices." Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly. "And now, having been saved by Mr. Cruz, you're seeing him differently." "I'm seeing him as he actually is, not as he appeared on paper. The man who pulled me from the ocean wasn't someone with poor judgment or inadequate character. He was someone who acted instinctively to save a life, even at risk to his own safety. That's exactly the kind of person you'd want raising a child." The session continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Brooke Walsh guiding Judge Reyes through an exploration of her career, her decision-making process, and the isolation that had characterized her personal life. By the time she left the office, Judge Reyes felt emotionally drained but somehow clearer about the source of her distress. Meanwhile, across town, Evan was having his own moment of clarity in a much more public setting. The coffee shop where he'd stopped for lunch was buzzing with conversation, but he'd managed to find a quiet corner table where he could review the legal documents Sarah Chen had given him for the upcoming hearing. He was so focused on the papers that he didn't notice Judge Reyes enter the coffee shop until she was standing beside his table, her expression uncertain and slightly embarrassed. "Mr. Cruz," she said quietly, "I hope you don't mind my interrupting." Evan looked up, startled to see her outside the formal setting of a courtroom or hospital room. She was dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail rather than her usual severe bun. She looked younger, more approachable, more human than he'd ever seen her. "Judge Reyes," he said, starting to stand, "please sit down. Can I buy you a coffee?" She hesitated for a moment, clearly aware of the ethical implications of even this brief interaction. But then she nodded and took the seat across from him, accepting his offer of coffee with a small smile that transformed her entire face. "I wanted to thank you again," she said when he returned with her latte. "I know I said it at the hospital, but it doesn't feel like enough. You saved my life." Evan shrugged uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Judge Reyes said firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did. I've seen enough of human nature to know that heroism isn't as common as we'd like to believe." They sat in silence for a moment, both aware that they were navigating uncharted territory. The professional boundaries that had defined their previous interactions no longer applied, but they hadn't established new ones to replace them. "How is Maya handling everything?" Judge Reyes asked finally. The question surprised Evan with its genuine concern. She's confused about why her mother showed up at school unexpectedly. She doesn't understand why saving someone's life is causing problems instead of making things better. "Children see things more clearly than adults sometimes," Judge Reyes observed. "They haven't learned to complicate simple truths." Evan studied her face, looking for clues about what she was thinking. Maya drew a picture of the rescue. She wanted to give it to you, to thank you for letting me be a hero." The comment brought tears to Judge Reyes' eyes, though she tried to hide them behind her coffee cup. "She sounds like a remarkable little girl." "She is," Evan said simply. "She's everything good in my life." Judge Reyes set down her cup and looked directly at him. "I want you to know that I never took your case lightly. Every decision I made, every continuance I granted, was because I was trying to do what was best for Maya." "I know," Evan replied. "I may not have agreed with your rulings, but I never doubted that you were trying to be fair." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer who recognized Judge Reyes from newspaper photos. The woman whispered something to her companion, pointing in their direction, and both Evan and Judge Reyes realized that their innocent coffee meeting was about to become public knowledge. "I should go," Judge Reyes said, gathering her purse and standing quickly. "Judge Reyes," Evan called after her. She turned back, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the crowded coffee shop. "Maya's picture, if you ever want to see it." "I'd like that very much," she said softly, then hurried out the door before anyone could approach them. That evening, the coffee shop encounter was reported on a local legal blog, complete with speculation about what Judge Reyes and Evan Cruz might have been discussing. The post was picked up by other media outlets, adding another layer of scrutiny to both of their lives. But for Evan, the brief conversation had provided something he hadn't expected, the sense that Judge Reyes saw him as more than just a case file, that she understood the depth of his love for Maya and the sincerity of his commitment to being a good father. It wasn't enough to change the legal proceedings, but it was something to hold on to as he prepared for the fight ahead. The worn copy of the Judicial Ethics Handbook lay open on Judge Reyes' desk, its pages marked with yellow highlighter and small handwritten notes that traced her 15 years of careful adherence to professional standards. Canon 2 stared back at her from page 47. "A judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities." The words that had once provided clear guidance now felt like an accusation. Judge Reyes had been studying the handbook for 2 hours, searching for precedent that might help her understand how to navigate the ethical minefield that her life had become. The formal inquiry from the Judicial Ethics Committee would begin next week, and she needed to prepare responses to questions that had no easy answers. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mentor, Judge Patricia Morrison, who had served as her guide during her early years on the bench. "Can we talk? This situation isn't as complicated as you're making it." But Judge Morrison didn't understand the psychological shift that had occurred since the rescue. The certainty that had characterized Judge Reyes' decision-making for 15 years had been shaken to its foundation. At the courthouse, Evan's character witnesses were gathering in the hallway, outside Judge Martinez's chambers. The group was more diverse than anyone might have expected for a lifeguard's custody hearing. Mrs. Patterson, Maya's teacher, Dr. Rodriguez, Maya's pediatrician, Tom Bradley, the beach patrol supervisor, Maria Santos, who owned the taco stand where Evan and Maya ate dinner twice a week, and Janet Chen, the librarian who had watched Maya blossom during their weekly story times. Sarah Chen was reviewing their testimony notes, ensuring that each witness could speak to specific aspects of Evan's character and parenting abilities. "Remember," she told the group, "we're not here to attack Carmen Rivera or question her motives. We're here to demonstrate that Maya is thriving in her current situation and that Evan provides exactly the kind of stable, loving environment she needs." Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses nervously. In her 30 years of teaching, she'd never testified in a custody case, but she couldn't remain silent when she saw a good father being challenged. "Maya is one of the brightest, most well-adjusted children I've ever taught," she said to the group. "Her reading level is 2 grades above her age group. She's socially confident, and she clearly adores her father. I've seen children from broken homes, and Maya doesn't fit that profile at all." Dr. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "From a medical standpoint, Maya has received excellent care. Her vaccinations are current. She's never missed a wellness visit. And when she had her appendectomy last year, Evan handled the emergency better than many two-parent families I've worked with. Tom Bradley, weathered from 30 years of beach patrol work, had perhaps the most insight into Evan's character. "I've worked with a lot of lifeguards over the years," he said. "Most of them are good at their jobs, but Evan is exceptional. He's the guy other lifeguards call when they need backup. He's the one parents seek out when their kids want to learn about water safety. The rescue that's causing all this fuss wasn't unusual for him, it was just the one that made the news." Inside Judge Martinez's chambers, Carmen Rivera sat with her lawyer, David Thornton, reviewing their strategy for undermining these character witnesses. Thornton had spent considerable time researching each person who planned to testify, looking for any weakness or bias that might discredit their testimony. "The teacher is clearly emotionally invested in the child," Thornton explained to Carmen. "We can suggest that her testimony is based on sentiment rather than objective assessment. The doctor has only seen Maya for routine care. He can't speak to her home environment or emotional stability. The lifeguard supervisor is obviously going to support his employee." Carmen listened with growing unease. When she'd first filed for custody, the decision had seemed straightforward. She'd improved her life circumstances, could offer Maya better opportunities, and deserved a chance to make up for her earlier mistakes. But sitting in the courthouse, hearing about the web of relationships that supported Evan and Maya, she was beginning to understand what she'd been absent from. "What about the media attention?" she asked Thornton. "You said we could use that to show instability." "We can, and we will," Thornton assured her. "A child shouldn't be subjected to public scrutiny because of her father's desire for attention. The fact that reporters are asking questions at her school, that other parents are treating her differently, that's harmful to her development." But even as Thornton spoke, Carmen wondered if the media attention was really harmful or just inconvenient for their legal strategy. Maya seemed to be handling the situation with remarkable resilience, according to all accounts. Perhaps the instability they were claiming existed more in the courtroom than in Maya's actual experience. Meanwhile, Judge Reyes was facing her own scrutiny in a conference room at the courthouse. The Judicial Ethics Committee had convened an informal preliminary meeting to understand the circumstances surrounding her recusal from the Cruz case. 3 senior judges sat across from her at the polished conference table, their expressions neutral, but their questions pointed. "Judge Reyes," began Judge William Harrison, the committee chair, "help us understand why this custody case remained on your docket for such an extended period. Your average case resolution time is typically much faster." The question went to the heart of Judge Reyes' internal struggle. She'd been delaying the Cruz decision not because the case was legally complex, but because something about it had troubled her from the beginning. Carmen Rivera's abandonment of her 3-year-old daughter, followed by a sudden return when it was convenient, had triggered personal memories that she'd tried to suppress. "The case presented some unusual circumstances," she replied carefully. "The child had been thriving in the father's care for an extended period, and I wanted to ensure that any change in custody would truly serve her best interests." Judge Harrison consulted his notes. But the evidence seemed to favor the mother's petition fairly clearly. Stable employment, better living conditions, 2-parent household. What specific factors caused your hesitation? Judge Reyes realized she was being asked to explain intuition in legal terms, to justify emotional responses that had no place in judicial decision-making. "I was concerned about the mother's previous abandonment and the potential for future instability." Previous abandonment that had been acknowledged and addressed in her petition, observed Judge Martinez's colleague, Judge Sarah Kim. The mother had been forthcoming about her past mistakes and demonstrated significant improvement in her life circumstances. The questions continued for another hour, each one designed to determine whether Judge Reyes had allowed personal bias to influence her handling of the case. By the time she left the conference room, she felt drained and uncertain about her own motives and decision-making process. That evening, as Judge Reyes sat in her empty house, trying to process the day's events, she received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rodriguez, Maya's pediatrician. She almost didn't answer. Any contact with people involved in the Cruz case could create additional ethical complications. But something about the doctor's voice when he left a voicemail compelled her to call back. "Judge Reyes," Dr. Rodriguez said when she reached him, "I know this is unusual, but I felt I had to speak with you. I'm testifying in the Cruz custody case tomorrow, and there are some things about Maya's medical history that I think you should know. Doctor, I can't discuss the case. I've recused myself." "I understand, but what I'm about to tell you isn't about the legal proceedings. It's about a little girl who nearly lost her father once before." Dr. Rodriguez went on to explain an incident that hadn't been included in the court records. When Maya was 5, Evan had suffered a severe allergic reaction to shellfish while they were at a beach barbecue. Maya had been the one to call 911, following the emergency procedures her father had taught her. She'd stayed calm, provided clear information to the dispatcher, and remained with Evan until the paramedics arrived. Most adults would have panicked in that situation, Dr. Rodriguez explained. But Maya handled it like a little soldier. When I asked her how she knew what to do, she said her daddy had taught her that helping people was the most important thing in the world. The story hit Judge Reyes with unexpected force. Maya's maturity and resilience weren't just natural characteristics, they were the result of being raised by someone who valued service to others above personal safety. Evan had taught his daughter not just how to handle emergencies, but how to see helping others as a fundamental responsibility. After hanging up, Judge Reyes sat in her study and finally understood why she'd been delaying the Cruz decision for so many months. It wasn't legal complexity or procedural concerns that had given her pause. It was the recognition, somewhere in her subconscious, that the evidence presented in court didn't match the reality of the father-daughter relationship she was being asked to evaluate. Carmen Rivera could offer Maya material advantages and a traditional family structure. But Evan Cruz had already given his daughter something more valuable, a moral foundation based on compassion, service, and putting others' needs before your own. The rescue that had complicated both of their lives was simply the most visible example of values that he'd been modeling for Maya every day. The next morning, Judge Reyes made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. She called Judge Martinez's clerk and requested a meeting not to discuss the case details, but to provide information about Maya's medical history that had been omitted from the record. It was a careful line to walk, but Dr. Rodriguez was right. Some things were more important than procedural concerns. Judge Martinez listened to her account of Maya's handling of her father's medical emergency with growing interest. The incident painted a picture of a child who had been well prepared for crisis situations, who had internalized lessons about responsibility and service that most adults never learned. "This information should be part of the record," Judge Martinez agreed. "It speaks to both the child's maturity and the father's preparation of her for real-world situations." As Judge Reyes left Martinez's chambers, she realized that she'd found a way to honor both her ethical obligations and her personal convictions. She couldn't rule on the Cruz case, but she could ensure that all relevant information was available to the judge who would. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small act of advocacy for a child who deserved better than what the legal system was prepared to give her. The afternoon brought news that would change everything. David Thornton had filed a motion claiming that Judge Reyes's meeting with Judge Martinez constituted improper ex parte communication and grounds for Martinez to recuse himself as well. If granted, the motion would force the case to be reassigned to yet another judge, creating even more delays and complications. But as Judge Reyes read Thornton's motion, she realized that Carmen's lawyer had made a crucial error. By claiming improper communication, he was opening the door for the ethical committee to examine all communications related to the case, including the information he'd fed to Judge Reyes during the original proceedings. If her past rulings had been based on incomplete or misleading information, that would constitute a much more serious ethical violation than her meeting with Martinez. For the first time since the rescue, Judge Reyes felt something approaching optimism. The truth had a way of surfacing, even in the most complex legal proceedings. And the truth about Evan Cruz was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. The private investigator's report arrived at Sarah Chen's office on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier in a manila envelope marked "Confidential Attorney, Eyes Only." Sarah had hired Marcus Webb reluctantly, knowing that investigating Carmen Rivera felt like an admission that they were losing the case on its merits. But Thornton's aggressive tactics and the expedited hearing schedule had left little choice. What she found in Webb's 20-page report was far more damaging than she'd expected. Carmen Rivera's stable employment at the healthcare marketing firm was on shaky ground. She'd been placed on probation 3 months earlier for repeatedly calling in sick, missing important client presentations, and showing signs of impairment during work hours. Her supervisor had documented concerns about her behavior and was building a case for termination. The long-term relationship with Mark Stevens, that Carmen had presented as evidence of family stability, was equally problematic. Stevens had 2 DUI convictions in the past 5 years and was currently enrolled in a court-mandated alcohol treatment program. More troubling, Webb had uncovered 3 domestic disturbance calls to the apartment Carmen shared with Stevens, though no charges had been filed. But the most damaging revelation was financial. Carmen's motivation for seeking custody wasn't maternal instinct, it was money. Stevens came from a wealthy family and had promised to establish a trust fund for Maya if Carmen gained custody. The arrangement would provide Carmen with access to significant funds for Maya's care and support, with minimal oversight of how the money was actually spent. Sarah stared at the report, feeling sick. While Evan had been struggling to pay legal fees and provide for Maya on a lifeguard's salary, Carmen had been scheming to use her daughter as a pathway to financial security. The abandoned 3-year-old had become a commodity in her mother's relationship negotiations. Webb's investigation had also revealed how David Thornton had been feeding Judge Reyes misleading information about Evan's circumstances. The report about the missed vaccination appointment, for instance, had failed to mention that Maya was sick that day, and the appointment had been rescheduled by the doctor's office. The late pickup from school had occurred because Evan was performing CPR on a tourist who'd had a heart attack on the beach. Each piece of evidence that had made Evan look inadequate was either taken out of context or deliberately misrepresented. Carmen's lawyer had been building a case based on selective presentation of facts, knowing that Judge Reyes would rely on the information provided by both attorneys to make her decision. Sarah immediately called Evan at the lifeguard station. "We need to meet tonight," she said without preamble. "I have information that changes everything." Meanwhile, Judge Reyes was having her own revelation in Dr. Walsh's office. The therapy sessions had helped her process the trauma of the near drowning, but they'd also forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her career and decision-making process. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Judge Reyes told Dr. Walsh, "about how I might have been looking at statistics instead of seeing people. I requested the complete case files for every custody decision I've made in the past 5 years. Dr. Walsh raised an eyebrows. "That must have been quite a project." 237 cases, Judge Reyes replied, "and a pattern I never noticed before. In nearly every case where I awarded custody to the parent with better financial resources, the child had been thriving with the other parent. I told myself I was following legal precedent, but I think I was following my own biases." The admission was painful but liberating. Judge Reyes had grown up poor, raised by a single mother who'd struggled to provide basic necessities. She'd convinced herself that financial stability was the most important factor in a child's welfare, because it was what she'd lacked as a child. "What kind of biases?" Dr. Walsh asked gently. "I think I was punishing single parents for being in the situation I grew up in. I was so determined not to subject children to poverty that I forgot there are worse things than being poor." Judge Reyes described her own childhood, a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, a series of apartments in declining neighborhoods, the constant stress of unpaid bills and eviction notices. She'd promised herself that she'd never be poor again, and she'd unconsciously extended that promise to every child who appeared in her courtroom. But Maya Cruz isn't poor, she realized aloud. She may not have everything money can buy, but she has something more valuable as father, who loves her unconditionally and would do anything to protect her. Dr. Walsh nodded. And recognizing that doesn't diminish the struggles you faced as a child. It just means you're seeing the situation more completely now. The breakthrough felt seismic. For the first time in her career, Judge Reyes was questioning not just individual decisions, but the entire framework she'd used to evaluate family situations. She'd been so focused on preventing the kind of childhood she'd experienced that she'd risked creating different kinds of harm. That evening, Evan sat in Sarah Chen's office and listened to her read from the private investigator's report. Each revelation felt like a punch to the gut, not because the information was surprising, but because it confirmed his worst fears about Carmen's motives. She never wanted Maya back because she missed her, he said quietly. She wanted her back because she was worth something to Mark Stevens. Sarah nodded grimly. The financial arrangement is documented in text messages between Carmen and Stevens. They refer to Maya as the investment and discuss how the trust fund money could be used for their own purposes. Evan thought about Maya's confusion when Carmen had appeared at her school, the calculated way Carmen had spoken about their future together. His ex-wife hadn't been reaching out to her daughter, she'd been appraising an asset. "What does this mean for the hearing?" he asked. "It means we have grounds to expose Carmen's real motivations and to challenge every piece of evidence Thornton presented to Judge Reyes. More importantly, it means we can request an investigation into whether Judge Reyes's original rulings were based on deliberately misleading information." The implications were staggering. If Carmen's lawyer had been feeding false or incomplete information to Judge Reyes, it wouldn't just vindicate Evan, it would call into question other cases where Thornton had represented clients. The ethical violations could end his career and lead to criminal charges for fraud. But Sarah was also concerned about the personal cost to Judge Reyes. If we pursue this angle, Althea Reyes is going to discover that she's been making decisions based on lies for months. That's going to be devastating for someone who's built her career on careful, informed judgment. Evan was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Judge Reyes had already been through enough: the near drowning, the forced recusal, the ethics inquiry. Learning that she'd been manipulated by Carmen's lawyer would add another layer of trauma to an already difficult situation. "She has a right to know," he said finally. "If Thornton was feeding her false information, it wasn't just my case that was affected. How many other families might have been hurt by his tactics?" Sarah nodded reluctantly. She knew Evan was right, but she also knew that exposing Thornton's deception would send shockwaves through the family court system. Judges relied on attorneys to present accurate information. If that trust had been systematically violated, it would call dozens of rulings into question. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out another section of Webb's report. "Carmen's drug use." The investigator found evidence of cocaine possession charges that were expunged from her record. The charges were filed just 6 months before she abandoned Maya. The timeline was damning. Carmen hadn't left because motherhood was too difficult. She'd left because she was struggling with addiction and facing potential jail time. The expunged charges explained her sudden departure and her 2-year absence. She'd been in treatment, not pursuing career opportunities as her lawyer had claimed. "The treatment records are sealed," Sarah continued, but Webb was able to confirm that she completed a residential program in Arizona. That's where she was when Maya had her appendectomy, not on a business trip. Evan felt a familiar surge of anger at Carmen's lies, but underneath it was something unexpected: pity. Addiction was a disease, and Carmen had clearly been struggling with demons that went far beyond simple selfishness. But that didn't excuse her current manipulation of Maya or her willingness to traumatize their daughter for financial gain. "What about now?" he asked. "Is she still using?" Webb couldn't confirm current drug use, but her work performance issues and the domestic disturbance calls suggest ongoing problems. Either addiction or something else that's affecting her stability. Sarah closed the report and leaned back in her chair. Evan, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for Maya to learn about her mother's problems? If we present this evidence, it's going to become public record. Someday, Maya will be old enough to understand what her mother was really doing. Evan thought about his daughter's innocent trust, her belief that people were basically good, her drawings of superheroes and happy families. The truth about Carmen would shatter some of that innocence, but lies had a way of causing even more damage in the long run. Maya deserves to know the truth about her life, he said. Maybe not all the details right now, but she deserves to understand why her mother left and why she came back. I won't build our future on deception. The next morning, Judge Reyes received a call that would change her understanding of everything that had happened over the past months. Sarah Chen had requested an emergency meeting to present new evidence that had bearing on the judicial ethics inquiry. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, with representatives from the Ethics Committee present. Judge Reyes sat in the conference room as Sarah methodically presented Webb's findings. Each revelation hit her like a physical blow. The falsified evidence, the selective presentation of facts, the financial motivations behind Carmen's custody petition. Everything she'd believed about the Cruz case had been carefully constructed lies. You're saying that Mr. Thornton deliberately misled the court? Asked Judge Harrison, the Ethics Committee chair. I'm saying that Mr. Thornton presented incomplete and misleading information while knowing the full facts, Sarah replied carefully. The missed vaccination appointment, for instance. He presented it as evidence of neglect while knowing that Maya was sick and the appointment had been rescheduled by the doctor's office. Judge Reyes felt sick as she realized the implications. How many of my rulings were based on this kind of selective information? We've only investigated the Cruz case, Sarah said, but given Mr. Thornton's pattern of behavior, there might be others. Judge Harrison was taking detailed notes, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Deliberate deception of the court was a serious offense that could result in disbarment and criminal charges. But the broader implications were even more troubling. If one attorney was systematically misleading judges, how many others might be doing the same? Judge Reyes, Sarah said gently, there's something else you should know. Mr. Cruz specifically asked me to make sure you understood that he doesn't blame you for the original rulings. He recognizes that you were making decisions based on the information you were given. The kindness in Evan's message was almost too much to bear. Judge Reyes had been prepared to separate him from his daughter based on lies, and his response was to offer her absolution. It was exactly the kind of character that Maya needed in a father, and exactly the kind of character that the legal system had failed to recognize. After the meeting, Judge Reyes sat alone in her chambers, trying to process what she'd learned. Her careful, methodical approach to jurisprudence had been turned against her by an attorney who understood how to manipulate her reliance on documentation and precedent. She'd been played, and the result had almost been the destruction of a loving family. But there was something else in the investigator's report that troubled her even more. The evidence that Carmen was using Maya as a financial asset. Judge Reyes had seen enough custody cases to recognize the signs of parental alienation and exploitation, but she'd missed them in this case because the lawyer had presented such a convincing alternative narrative. That evening, she did something she'd never done before in her judicial career. She drove to the beach where Evan worked, hoping to find him at the end of his shift. She needed to apologize, not just for the legal complications, but for failing to see what should have been obvious from the beginning. She found him cleaning equipment at the lifeguard station, his movements methodical and purposeful even at the end of a long day. When he saw her approaching, he stopped what he was doing and walked over to meet her. "Judge Reyes," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "is everything okay?" "I came to apologize," she said without preamble, "for not seeing what was right in front of me, for letting myself be misled by someone who was more interested in winning than in Maya's welfare." Evan was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the fading afternoon light. "You were trying to do your job. You can't apologize for trusting that people were telling you the truth. But I should have looked deeper. I should have seen that the evidence didn't match the reality of your relationship with Maya. Maybe, Evan said, but you saw it eventually. That's what matters. Judge Reyes felt tears forming in her eyes. I almost destroyed your family because I was too focused on rules and precedent to see the people behind the case files. But you didn't destroy us, Evan said gently, and now Maya has a chance at the kind of justice she actually deserves. As Judge Reyes drove home from the beach, she realized that Evan Cruz had taught her something more valuable than any law book or judicial seminar. Sometimes the most important decisions required not just legal expertise, but human wisdom and the courage to look beyond surface appearances to deeper truths. The next phase of the custody battle would be different. The lies had been exposed, the real motivations revealed, and the true character of both parents finally visible. Justice, it seemed, had a way of surfacing even when people tried to bury it under deception and manipulation. Maya's diary lay open on her small desk, its pink pages filled with the careful handwriting of a 7-year-old who was trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become very complicated. Evan discovered it by accident when he was helping her clean her room the night before the final custody hearing, and the entries broke his heart with their innocent wisdom and desperate hope. Dear Diary, the most recent entry read, "Mommy wants me to live with her and Mark, but I don't want to. Mark smells like the bitter medicine Dr. Rodriguez gives me when I'm sick, and he gets loud when he watches TV. Daddy never gets loud except when he's warning people about dangerous waves. I wish I could tell the judge that I want to stay with Daddy, but Sarah says kids don't get to choose until they're older. That doesn't seem fair because it's my life." Evan sat on the edge of Maya's bed, reading entry after entry that revealed his daughter's mature understanding of the situation. She knew more than the adults had given her credit, for she'd overheard phone conversations, picked up on Carmen's artificial affection, noticed Mark Stevens' drinking problem during her supervised visits. Most heartbreaking of all, she understood that her opinion might not matter in the final decision. "Daddy looks sad all the time now," another entry read. "He tries to hide it, but I can tell because his smile doesn't reach his eyes like it used to. I drew him another picture of us together at the beach, but he looked like he wanted to cry when I gave it to him. I think he's scared too. I don't understand why grown-ups make everything so complicated. I love Daddy, and he loves me. Isn't that enough?" The final entry was dated that morning. "Tomorrow the judge decides where I live. I'm going to wear my lucky dress and my special necklace that Daddy gave me for my birthday. I'm going to pray that the new judge can see what Judge Reyes couldn't see before she got saved by Daddy. I want to tell someone that Daddy is the best daddy in the world, and that losing him would be worse than when Mommy left the first time, because now I'm old enough to understand what it means." Evan closed the diary with shaking hands, overwhelmed by his daughter's emotional maturity and terrified by her fear of losing him. Maya had been carrying this burden silently, trying to protect him from her own anxiety while processing complex adult emotions that no 7-year-old should have to handle. He found Maya in the living room, practicing her spelling words with the focused concentration she brought to all her schoolwork. She looked up when he entered, and he could see the worry in her dark eyes despite her attempt to appear normal. "Mija," he said, sitting down beside her on the couch, "we need to talk about tomorrow." Maya set down her pencil and turned to face him, her expression serious. "Are you going to tell me that everything will be okay, even if it might not be?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Maya had always been perceptive, but her recent experiences had aged her in ways that made his chest ache. "I'm going to tell you the truth," he said. "Tomorrow, Judge Martinez will decide where you live. I'm hoping and praying that you get to stay with me, but I can't promise that's what will happen." Maya nodded solemnly. "I know. I've been listening to your phone calls with Sarah." "Oh, sweetheart." Evan pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You shouldn't have to worry about grown-up problems." "But they're not just grown-up problems if they're about me," Maya pointed out with 7-year-old logic. "It's my life too." Evan realized that Maya was right. The adults had been so focused on protecting her from the stress of the custody battle that they'd forgotten she was the person most affected by its outcome. She deserved to have her voice heard, even if the legal system wasn't designed to listen to children her age. "Maya," he said carefully, "if you could tell Judge Martinez one thing tomorrow, what would it be?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, her face scrunched up in concentration. "I would tell him that home isn't about having the biggest house or the most money. Home is where someone loves you enough to teach you how to be brave and kind and helpful. Daddy taught me how to call 911 when he got sick, and how to swim so I'll be safe in the ocean, and how to help people who need help. That's what makes a good home." The simplicity and truth of her words left Evan speechless. Maya had articulated something that all the legal briefs and expert testimony had failed to capture. Family wasn't about meeting external criteria for adequacy, but about creating an environment where children could grow into the best versions of themselves. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Martinez was reviewing the updated case files that had been submitted following the private investigator's revelations. The evidence against Carmen Rivera and her attorney was damning, but Martinez was a careful judge who wanted to ensure that his decision was based on current circumstances rather than past mistakes. He'd ordered new psychological evaluations for all parties, including Maya, and the results had been illuminating. Maya's evaluation showed a remarkable level of emotional stability and maturity, with strong attachment to her father and anxiety about potential separation from him. Carmen's evaluation revealed ongoing issues with impulse control and difficulty accepting responsibility for past actions. Most telling was Mark Stevens' evaluation. The court-appointed psychologist had noted indicators of alcohol dependency and anger management issues that made him unsuitable as a parental figure. The domestic disturbance calls that Webb had uncovered were part of a pattern of volatile behavior that posed potential risks to a child. Judge Martinez had also spoken privately with Dr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Patterson, Maya's teacher, both of whom painted a picture of a child who was thriving in her current environment. Maya's academic performance, social development, and emotional resilience all indicated that Evan's parenting was not just adequate, but exceptional. But the judge was also troubled by something else: Maya's age and the legal precedent that generally didn't allow children under 12 to express custody preferences. The child was clearly intelligent and mature enough to understand her situation, yet the system provided no formal mechanism for her voice to be heard. That evening, Judge Martinez made an unusual decision. He called both attorneys to inform them that he would be conducting an in-camera interview with Maya, private conversation in his chambers, where she could express her feelings without the pressure of a formal courtroom setting. "This is highly irregular." David Thornton protested when Sarah Chen called to inform Evan of the judge's decision. "Children Maya's age aren't considered competent to make custody decisions." "The judge isn't asking her to make a decision," Sarah replied firmly. "He's giving her an opportunity to provide input about her own life. That's entirely within his discretion." Evan felt a mixture of hope and terror at the news. Maya was articulate and mature for her age, but she was still a 7-year-old who would be speaking to a judge about whether she could stay with the only parent who'd been consistently present in her life. The pressure on her would be enormous. Judge Reyes, meanwhile, was facing her own moment of reckoning. The Judicial Ethics Committee had completed their preliminary investigation and concluded that she had been the victim of deliberate deception rather than the perpetrator of judicial misconduct. The committee was now focusing their attention on David Thornton's conduct and its potential impact on other cases. But vindication by the Ethics Committee didn't erase Judge Reyes's sense of responsibility for what had happened. She'd been manipulated, but she'd also allowed herself to be guided by biases that had nearly resulted in a terrible injustice. The therapy sessions with Dr. Walsh had helped her understand the psychological roots of her decision-making, but understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. She'd made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her professional reputation. She was going to attend Maya's custody hearing as an observer. Not to influence the proceedings, but to witness the resolution of a case that had changed her understanding of justice and her own role in administering it. The night before the hearing, Evan lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The rescue that had seemed like such a clear-cut moment of heroism had unleashed a cascade of complications that had tested every assumption about justice, family, and the nature of doing the right thing. But as he listened to Maya's steady breathing from her bedroom, Evan realized that the complications had also revealed truths that might have remained hidden otherwise. Carmen's real motivations, Thornton's deceptive tactics, Judge Reyes's capacity for growth and self-reflection, all of it had been exposed by the simple act of saving someone's life. Tomorrow, Judge Martinez would decide whether Maya would stay with the father who'd raised her or go to live with the mother who'd abandoned her and the man who saw her as a financial opportunity. The legal arguments had been made, the evidence presented, the expert opinions filed. Now, it would come down to something simpler and more fundamental, whether the system could recognize love when it saw it, and whether justice could triumph over technicality. Maya's diary entries had expressed it perfectly. It was her life, and she deserved to have her voice heard in determining how it would unfold. As Evan finally drifted off to sleep, he thought about the superhero in Maya's drawing, cape flowing as he pulled someone from the waves. Tomorrow, he would need to be that hero again, not by diving into dangerous waters, but by fighting for the right of a little girl to stay with the parent who loved her most. The ocean outside his window was calm, its waves lapping gently against the shore. But Evan knew that calm seas could change quickly, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against natural forces, but against human institutions that had lost sight of their fundamental purpose, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The courtroom was fuller than anyone had expected for a custody hearing. Word had spread through the legal community about the dramatic revelations in the Cruz case, and several attorneys had come to observe how Judge Martinez would handle the fallout from David Thornton's deceptive practices. In the back row, Judge Reyes sat quietly, her presence unobtrusive but significant. Maya wore her lucky dress, a blue sundress with white flowers that Evan had bought for her 7th birthday, and the small silver necklace he'd given her the previous Christmas. She sat between Evan and Sarah Chen, her small hands folded in her lap, trying to look brave despite the intimidating formal setting. Judge Martinez's gavel rested on the bench like a symbol of the authority that would determine Maya's future. The judge himself appeared tired but resolved, carrying the weight of a decision that would affect not just this family but potentially others, if his ruling set new precedents for handling attorney misconduct. "Before we begin," Judge Martinez announced, "I want to address the elephant in the room. This court has received evidence that Mr. Thornton may have presented misleading information in previous proceedings. While those allegations are being investigated separately, they have informed my review of all evidence in this case." David Thornton shifted uncomfortably at the plaintiff's table. Carmen sat beside him, her usual composure cracked by the revelations about her true motivations and Mark Stevens' background. She'd been expecting a routine custody transfer based on her improved circumstances. Instead, she was facing questions about her integrity and fitness as a parent. "Your Honor," Thornton began, rising to address the court, "my client acknowledges past mistakes but has worked hard to rebuild her life. The allegations about her current situation are based on speculation and irrelevant to her ability to provide for Maya's future." Judge Martinez consulted his notes. "Mr. Thornton, the court has received evidence that your client's primary motivation for seeking custody involves financial arrangements with Mr. Stevens that would benefit her personally. How do you respond to that allegation?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Carmen had clearly not expected her text messages with Mark Stevens to become public knowledge, and her expression revealed both shock and growing panic. "Those messages were taken out of context, Your Honor. Ms. Rivera is naturally concerned about providing financial security for her daughter. By referring to Maya as the investment," Judge Martinez's voice carried a sharp edge that made everyone in the courtroom tense. "By discussing how trust fund money could be redirected for adult purposes." Sarah Chen rose to present the evidence that had emerged from the private investigation. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow. Carmen's work problems, Mark Stevens' drinking, the domestic disturbance calls, the expunged drug charges that explained her original abandonment of Maya. Your Honor, Sarah concluded, this case isn't about choosing between two adequate parents. It's about protecting a child from being used as a pawn in her mother's financial schemes. When Sarah finished, Judge Martinez turned his attention to the character witnesses who had come to support Evan. Mrs. Patterson spoke movingly about Maya's academic achievements and emotional stability. Dr. Rodriguez testified about Evan's exemplary handling of medical emergencies and routine care. Tom Bradley described Evan's reputation among his colleagues and his dedication to public service. But it was Maria Santos, the owner of the taco stand, whose testimony provided the most compelling picture of Evan as a father. She described watching him patiently help Maya with homework at their outdoor tables, teaching her Spanish words and encouraging her curiosity about the world around them. Every Tuesday and Friday for 3 years, Maria testified, they come to my stand for dinner. Evan always makes sure Maya tries new foods, always listens to her stories about school, always treats her like her opinions matter. That little girl lights up when she sees her papa, and he lights up when he sees her. That's love, Your Honor. Real love. The testimony continued for 2 hours, building a comprehensive picture of Maya's life, with Evan versus the uncertainty and potential harm of living with Carmen and Mark Stevens. By the time the evidence phase concluded, it was clear that the private investigator's revelations had fundamentally shifted the case. Judge Martinez called a brief recess before the most anticipated part of the hearing, his in-camera interview with Maya. The courtroom emptied except for the court reporter and security personnel, leaving Maya alone with the judge who would decide her future. Maya, Judge Martinez said gently, his formal demeanor softening as he addressed the 7-year-old. Do you understand why you're here today? Maya nodded solemnly. You're deciding if I get to stay with Daddy, or if I have to go live with Mommy and Mark. That's right, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me will stay between us, unless you give me permission to share it. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Maya's voice was small but steady. Can you tell me about your life with your father? Maya's face brightened immediately. Daddy takes care of me when I'm sick, and he helps me with my homework, and he teaches me about the ocean and how to be safe. He makes me breakfast every morning and reads me stories at night. When I was scared about starting 1st grade, he walked me to school every day until I felt brave enough to go by myself. Judge Martinez made notes as Maya spoke, struck by her maturity and the genuine affection in her voice when she talked about Evan. What about your mother and Mr. Stevens? How do you feel when you visit them? Maya's expression grew troubled. Mommy acts different now. She talks to me like I'm a baby, but then she gets frustrated when I don't understand things. And Mark? Maya hesitated, looking uncertain about whether she should continue. It's okay, Maya, you can tell me anything. Mark gets loud sometimes, and he smells funny. Not like cologne, but like medicine that tastes bad. He told Mommy I was quite an investment, and I didn't know what that meant, but it made me feel funny inside. The innocence with which Maya reported the conversation that had been so damaging in the adult proceedings was heartbreaking. She'd heard herself referred to as an investment without understanding the implications, but her instincts had told her something was wrong. Maya, if you could choose where to live, what would you choose? The question that the legal system rarely allowed children her age to answer hung between them. Maya took a deep breath, gathering her courage to speak a truth that adults had been debating for months. I want to stay with Daddy, she said firmly. He's been taking care of me my whole life, and he's good at it. I know we don't have a lot of money, but we have enough. And I know our apartment is small, but it feels like home because Daddy makes it safe and happy. Judge Martinez felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This articulate, mature child had just expressed a preference that aligned with the evidence but challenged legal precedents about children's capacity for such decisions. Is there anything else you want me to know, Maya? Maya was quiet for a moment, then reached into her small purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote you a letter, in case I got too scared to say everything I wanted to say. Judge Martinez unfolded the paper and read Maya's careful cursive. "Dear Judge Martinez, I know grown-ups think kids don't know what's best for them. But I know what makes me happy and what makes me scared. Daddy makes me happy. He taught me that helping people is the most important thing you can do, and that's why he saved Judge Reyes even though he didn't know who she was. That's the kind of person I want to be when I grow up. Please let me stay with the daddy who teaches me how to be good. Love, Maya Cruz." The letter was both a child's plea and a wisdom that transcended her years. Judge Martinez carefully folded it and placed it in the case file, knowing that Maya's words would carry significant weight in his final decision. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Martinez's expression revealed nothing about his conversation with Maya. He called both attorneys to the bench for a brief conference, then returned to his seat behind the imposing wooden desk where so many family futures had been decided. The gavel in his hand represented more than judicial authority. It represented the power to honor a child's voice in determining her own future, to recognize that sometimes love mattered more than logic, and that justice required not just following the law but understanding its purpose. The signed custody order bore Judge Martinez's careful signature and the official seal of the family court, transforming Maya's future from uncertainty into legal certainty. But before he would deliver his decision, Judge Martinez wanted to address the broader implications of what had been revealed during the proceedings. "In my 23 years on this bench," Judge Martinez began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom, "I have never encountered a case where an attorney's deception was so systematic and so damaging to the interests of the child involved. Mr. Thornton, your conduct has not only harmed this family, but undermined the integrity of these proceedings." David Thornton stood as if to object, but Judge Martinez's stern expression silenced him before he could speak. "The evidence presented demonstrates that you knowingly withheld crucial information, misrepresented facts, and coached your client to conceal circumstances that were directly relevant to this custody determination. This court is referring your conduct to the state bar for investigation and potential disciplinary action." Carmen Rivera visibly paled at the judge's words. She'd expected legal victory, not public condemnation of her motives and methods. Mark Stevens, who had attended the hearing to show support for Carmen's petition, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "Furthermore," Judge Martinez continued, "this court finds that Ms. Rivera's petition for custody was motivated primarily by financial considerations rather than genuine concern for Maya's welfare. The text messages between Ms. Rivera and Mr. Stevens, referring to Maya as the investment and discussing how trust fund money could be redirected, demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of parental responsibility. Judge Martinez turned his attention to the custody order that would determine Maya's future. Maya herself sat perfectly still between Evan and Sarah Chen, her small hands gripping the sides of her chair as she waited to learn whether she would stay with the only parent she really remembered. "However," the judge said, his tone softening slightly, "this case has also demonstrated something remarkable about the resilience of families and the power of love to overcome legal obstacles. Maya Cruz is an extraordinary child, mature, articulate, and emotionally stable. Her success is a direct reflection of the quality of parenting she has received." Evan felt his heart pounding as Judge Martinez prepared to announce his decision. Maya's small hand slipped into his, and he squeezed it gently, trying to convey reassurance he didn't entirely feel. The evidence before this court overwhelmingly supports one conclusion: Maya Cruz has thrived in her father's care. Her academic achievement, social development, and emotional maturity all indicate that Mr. Cruz has provided not just adequate parenting, but exceptional parenting under challenging circumstances. Judge Martinez looked directly at Maya, acknowledging her presence as more than just the subject of adult deliberations. "Maya, I want you to know that I carefully considered everything you told me in my chambers. Your voice matters in these proceedings, and your wisdom impressed me greatly. Maya's eyes widened at being addressed directly by the judge. In her limited experience with courtrooms, adults talked about children but rarely to them. Therefore, Judge Martinez announced, lifting the custody order. This court awards full physical and legal custody of Maya Cruz to her father, Evan Cruz. Rivera's petition for custody is denied. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Evan felt his knees go weak with relief, while Maya's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. Carmen Rivera looked stunned, as if she couldn't believe that her carefully planned legal strategy had failed so completely. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, given the evidence of Ms. Rivera's deceptive conduct and Mr. Stevens' unsuitability as a parental figure, this court is suspending Ms. Rivera's visitation rights, pending completion of court-ordered counseling and substance abuse evaluation. The additional restrictions were unexpected but necessary. Judge Martinez had seen enough evidence of Carmen's instability and poor judgment to conclude that unsupervised contact with Maya could be harmful. Sarah Chen rose to address the court. Your Honor, Mr. Cruz would like to thank the court for its careful consideration of this case. He bears no ill will toward Ms. Rivera and hopes that she will take advantage of the counseling resources to address her underlying issues. The grace in Evan's response impressed everyone present. Despite everything Carmen had put them through, he wasn't seeking revenge, just the right to continue raising his daughter in peace. Judge Martinez looked at Carmen Rivera with something approaching sympathy. Ms. Rivera, you have an opportunity here to address the issues that led to these circumstances. If you choose to do the work required, supervised visitation could be restored in the future, but that will depend entirely on your commitment to genuine change. Carmen nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. Whether they were tears of regret, disappointment, or genuine remorse was unclear, but for the first time since the proceedings began, she looked like someone who understood the magnitude of what she'd lost. Mark Stevens stood to leave with Carmen, but Judge Martinez's voice stopped him. Mr. Stevens, this court strongly advises you to have no further contact with Maya Cruz. Your background check reveals circumstances that make you unsuitable for any role in this child's life. As Carmen and Mark Stevens left the courtroom, their defeated posture contrasted sharply with the celebration beginning around Evan and Maya. Mrs. Patterson hugged them both, tears of joy in her eyes. Dr. Rodriguez shook Evan's hand with genuine warmth. Tom Bradley and Maria Santos beamed with satisfaction at seeing justice finally served. But the person whose reaction meant the most to Evan was Maya herself. She looked up at him with shining eyes and said, "We get to stay together, Daddy. Really stay together." "Really stay together," Evan confirmed, lifting her into his arms and holding her close. "Forever and always, mija." Judge Reyes approached them quietly as the courtroom began to empty. Her presence still carried the weight of judicial authority, but her expression was soft with genuine emotion. "Mr. Cruz," she said formally, then paused and began again. "Evan, I wanted to congratulate you and to apologize once more for how long this process took." Evan shifted Maya to one arm so he could extend his hand to Judge Reyes. "No apologies necessary, Your Honor. The system worked the way it was supposed to, eventually." "Maya," Judge Reyes said, addressing the little girl directly, "I understand you have a drawing for me." Maya's face lit up with excitement. "Daddy, can we give her the picture now?" Evan nodded, and Maya carefully pulled the folded superhero drawing from her small purse. She handed it to Judge Reyes with the solemnity of someone presenting an important gift. Judge Reyes unfolded the drawing and studied it carefully, the crayon superhero pulling a woman from bright blue waves, the smiling sun, the rainbow over the ocean. But what moved her most was the signature at the bottom, "For the lady Daddy saved, from Maya Cruz, age 7. "It's beautiful, Maya," Judge Reyes said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it always." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Judge Martinez called Evan back for a private word. "Mr. Cruz, I want you to know that Maya's testimony in chambers was remarkable. She demonstrated wisdom and maturity that many adults lack. You should be very proud of the young woman you're raising." Thank you, Your Honor. She's taught me as much as I've taught her. I'm also recommending that this case be studied by the Judicial College as an example of how attorney misconduct can compromise family court proceedings. Your experience may help prevent other families from facing similar situations. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, Evan felt like he was emerging from a long tunnel. The custody battle that had consumed his life for 2 years was finally over, and Maya was officially, legally, permanently his daughter. Maya slipped her hand into his as they walked toward their car. "Daddy, can we go to the beach now? I want to see where you work, where you saved Judge Reyes. I want to say thank you to the ocean for bringing us together." Evan smiled at his daughter's request, understanding her need to visit the place where their story had taken its dramatic turn. "Of course, Mija. We have all the time in the world now." As they drove towards Sunset Beach, Evan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The rescue that had seemed to complicate everything had actually simplified it, stripping away the legal maneuvering and false evidence to reveal the truth that had been there all along. Love was the only qualification that really mattered in parenting. The beach was busy with afternoon visitors, but Evan's colleagues at the lifeguard station welcomed them with cheers and congratulations. Tom Bradley had heard the news from Sarah Chen and had already spread the word among the beach patrol team. "This calls for a celebration," Tom announced, producing a small cake that the lifeguards had apparently prepared in advance. Though I think we all knew how this was going to turn out once the truth came to light. Maya beamed at the attention, finally able to enjoy being the center of positive attention rather than legal scrutiny. She helped Evan blow out the candles on the cake, making a wish that she whispered to him, "I wish that Judge Reyes finds someone who makes her as happy as you make me." The innocent generosity of the wish touched everyone who heard it. Even after everything Carmen and her lawyer had put them through, Maya's first thought was for someone else's happiness. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Judge Reyes appeared at the edge of the beach. She'd changed from her formal court attire into jeans and a simple sweater, looking more relaxed than Evan had ever seen her. "I hope you don't mind," she said, approaching their small celebration. "I wanted to see the place where it all began." Maya immediately ran to Judge Reyes, taking her hand and leading her toward the water's edge. "This is where Daddy saved you," she announced proudly. "Right here where the waves are biggest." Judge Reyes stood at the spot where Evan had pulled her from the churning water, looking out at the ocean with new appreciation for its power and unpredictability. "It's beautiful," she said. "I can see why you love working here." "It's different every day," Evan replied, joining them at the water's edge. "The ocean keeps you humble, reminds you that there are forces bigger than yourself." "Like justice," Judge Reyes observed quietly. "Real justice, not just legal procedure." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll in and out with eternal rhythm. The crisis that had brought them together was over, but the connection forged by crisis remained. "Judge Reyes," Maya said suddenly, tugging on her sweater, "Daddy says you don't have a family. Would you like to have dinner with us sometimes? We eat tacos at Maria's stand, and she makes the best guacamole in the world." The invitation was so innocent and genuine that Judge Reyes felt tears forming in her eyes. This child, who had every reason to resent the judge who had prolonged her family's suffering, was offering friendship and inclusion. "I would like that very much, Maya," Judge Reyes replied. "But you should know that judges have to be careful about personal relationships with people who have appeared in their courtrooms." "But you're not my judge anymore," Maya pointed out with 7-year-old logic. "Judge Martinez is my judge now, so we can be friends." Evan smiled at his daughter's reasoning. "Maya's right. The case is closed, and we're just people now. If you'd like to join us for dinner sometime, we'd be honored to have you." Judge Reyes looked at this father and daughter who had changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about justice and family. Evan Cruz had saved her life in more ways than one, pulling her from the ocean and showing her that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about daily acts of love and service. "I'd like that very much," she said finally, "but I should warn you I'm still learning how to be just a person instead of a judge." "We're good teachers," Maya said confidently. "Daddy taught me how to be brave, and I can teach you how to be fun." As they walked back toward the lifeguard station, where the celebration was winding down, Judge Reyes realized that this was what she'd been missing in her carefully ordered life: the messiness and joy of genuine human connection. She'd spent 15 years maintaining professional distance from the people whose lives she affected, telling herself it was necessary for objectivity. But objectivity without compassion wasn't justice, it was just bureaucracy. The custody order in her purse, one that made Maya's future with Evan official and permanent, represented more than a legal decision. It represented the possibility that the system could still recognize love when it saw it, that justice could still triumph over technicality, and that sometimes the most important rescues happened not in the ocean, but in courtrooms where children's futures hung in the balance. As the evening stars began to appear over the Pacific, Evan realized that the story that had begun with a rescue was really about salvation, not just Judge Reyes being saved from drowning, but all of them being saved from a system that had temporarily lost sight of its fundamental purpose: protecting families and serving justice rather than just following rules. The gavel had fallen, the decision was final, and Maya Cruz would grow up with the father who had never stopped fighting for her. But more than that, she would grow up knowing that love could overcome any obstacle, that heroes came in all forms, and that sometimes the most important victories were won not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence and unwavering devotion. 6 months after the custody hearing, the wedding ring that Judge Reyes had worn for 15 years sat in a small jewelry box on her dresser, finally removed from the finger where it had remained long after her marriage had ended. The ring represented a relationship built on professional compatibility rather than love, a union that had failed because both partners had been more committed to their careers than to each other. But this Saturday morning was different from the hundreds of solitary weekends that had preceded it. Judge Reyes had begun asking friends to call her Althea outside the courthouse, was getting ready for a day at the beach with Evan and Maya, a ritual that had become precious to all three of them over the past months. The friendship that had grown between them was careful and gradual, built on mutual respect and Maya's irrepressible enthusiasm for bringing people together. What had started as occasional dinners at Maria's taco stand had evolved into weekend outings, school events where Althea cheered for Maya's academic achievements, and quiet evenings where two adults who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances talked about everything except the legal case that had brought them together. Maya had been promoted to 3rd grade after testing showed she was reading at a 5th grade level. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, marveled at the 8-year-old's confidence and maturity, attributes that had been strengthened rather than damaged by her experience with the custody battle. Maya had learned that she had a voice that mattered, that adults could be trusted to listen to children's concerns, and that love was strong enough to overcome even legal challenges. Evan had been promoted to head lifeguard for the entire beach district, a position that came with better pay, benefits, and the respect of his colleagues throughout the region. The rescue that had initially complicated his life had ultimately enhanced his reputation, leading to speaking engagements about water safety and several commendations from the mayor's office. More importantly, the financial stability allowed him to move into a larger apartment with a real bedroom for Maya and enough space for the life they were building together. But the most significant change was in Althea herself. The therapy sessions with Dr. Walsh had continued, helping her understand not just the trauma of the near drowning, but the emotional isolation that had characterized her entire adult life. She'd spent so many years defining herself by her professional role that she'd forgotten how to simply be human in relationship with others. The beautiful thing about second chances, Dr. Walsh had observed during one of their sessions, is that they often come disguised as disasters. Your near drowning felt like a crisis, but it opened doors to connections you never would have made otherwise. Althea was learning to trust that assessment. Her relationship with Evan had developed slowly, built on friendship and shared commitment to Maya's welfare, before evolving into something deeper. They'd been careful not to rush, both aware that their unusual beginning required extra attention to ensure that their connection was genuine, rather than born of gratitude or trauma bonding. The beach community had embraced Althea as Evan's partner and Maya's honorary stepmother with the same warmth they'd shown in supporting Evan during the custody battle. Maria Santos had started setting aside a third chair at their usual table. Tom Bradley included Althea in lifeguard family barbecues, and Dr. Rodriguez had mentioned in passing that Maya's medical forms now listed 2 emergency contacts. Carmen Rivera had completed the court-ordered counseling and substance abuse program, but she'd made no attempt to resume contact with Maya. According to the update Sarah Chen provided, Carmen had moved to Oregon with a new boyfriend, apparently deciding that motherhood was still too complicated for her lifestyle. Maya had stopped asking about her mother's absence, focusing instead on the family she had, rather than the one she'd lost. Mark Stevens had been arrested for domestic violence in a separate incident, validating Judge Martinez's decision to prohibit his contact with Maya. The trust fund that had motivated Carmen's custody petition had been dissolved when Stevens' family learned about his legal troubles, removing the financial incentive that had driven the entire legal challenge. David Thornton had been disbarred following the state bar's investigation into his conduct. The inquiry had revealed a pattern of deceptive practices affecting multiple cases, leading to several custody decisions being overturned and families being reunited. Thornton's downfall had sent shockwaves through the family court system, leading to new protocols for verifying attorney submissions and protecting against future misconduct. This Saturday morning found Evan and Maya preparing a picnic lunch while waiting for Althea to arrive. Maya had insisted on making sandwiches herself, carefully arranging them in the cooler alongside fruit, chips, and the homemade cookies she'd baked with Althea the previous evening. "Do you think Althea will like the surprise?" Maya asked, referring to the small ceremony they'd planned for the anniversary of the rescue. "I think she'll love it, Mija," Evan replied, helping Maya pack the beach umbrella and chairs. She's been looking forward to this day. The surprise was Maya's idea. A small celebration at the exact spot where Evan had pulled Althea from the water, complete with a toast to new beginnings and a renewal of their commitment to being a family. Maya had written a speech for the occasion, practicing it in front of the mirror until she had every word memorized. When Althea arrived, her face glowed with the kind of happiness that had been absent from her life for too many years. She'd learned to laugh at Maya's jokes, to relax into Evan's steady presence, and to trust that love didn't have to be complicated or conditional to be real. "Are you ready for our adventure?" she asked Maya, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "I've been ready since I woke up," Maya replied. "I even made you a special sandwich with that cheese you like." The drive to the beach was filled with Maya's chatter about school, friends, and her latest art projector painting of the 3 of them at the water's edge, titled "My Family," in careful 8-year-old cursive. The painting would join Maya's superhero drawing in Althea's study, visual reminders of how an act of heroism had transformed all their lives. At the beach, they set up their chairs at the spot where the rescue had occurred, now marked in Maya's mind as the place where their real story began. The waves were gentle that day, lapping peacefully at the shore without the aggressive power that had nearly claimed Althea's life 6 months earlier. "1 year ago," Maya began, reading from her carefully prepared notes, "Daddy saved Althea from drowning, but really they saved each other. Daddy saved Althea's life, and Althea saved our family by making sure the truth came out in court." Evan and Althea exchanged a look of love and amazement at Maya's wisdom. The 8-year-old had understood something that the adults had taken months to recognize. The rescue had been mutual, with each person saving the others in different but equally important ways. "And now we're all saved," Maya continued, "because we found each other and decided to be a family, not because a judge said we had to be, but because we chose to love each other." Maya raised her small cup of lemonade in a toast. To Daddy, who teaches me how to be brave. To Althea, who teaches me that grown-ups can change and become better. And to all of us together, because families are made of love, not just blood. They touched their cups together in a toast that sealed their commitment to each other and to the future they were building together. Evan had found not just legal victory, but personal happiness. Althea had discovered that life outside the courtroom could be richer and more meaningful than professional success. Maya had gained not just security, but an expanded understanding of what family could look like. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that made California sunsets famous, Evan took Althea's hand and walked with her to the water's edge. Maya ran ahead, collecting shells and chasing waves, with the fearless joy of a child who knew she was safe and loved. "Do you ever regret it?" Althea asked quietly. "The rescue that complicated everything?" Evan smiled, watching Maya splash in the shallow water. "Never. That rescue brought you into our lives and helped us become the family we were meant to be. Even with all the legal drama and media attention?" "Especially because of all that," Evan replied. "It tested us and proved that what we have is strong enough to survive anything." Althea squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of connection that had been missing from her life for so long. "I love you both," she said simply, "more than I ever thought possible." "We love you too," Evan replied. "Maya and you were better people because you're in our lives." As they walked back toward their picnic setup, Maya came running up with her hands full of perfect shells. "Look what I found. We can make a necklace for our anniversary next year." The assumption that they would be together for many anniversaries to come filled both adults with quiet joy. Maya had accepted Althea into their family with the wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to everything she loved, and her confidence in their future together was both touching and inspiring. The beach began to empty as families packed up their belongings and headed home for dinner. Evan, Althea, and Maya were among the last to leave, reluctant to end a day that had been perfect in its simplicity and meaning. Driving home as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Maya fell asleep in the back seat, her head pillowed on the beach towel, clutching the shells she'd collected. In the front seat, Evan and Althea talked quietly about their plans for the future Maya's upcoming school performance, their summer vacation to the mountains, the possibility of moving in together when Althea's lease expired. They were ordinary conversations about ordinary lives, but they felt extraordinary to two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances. The judge who had almost ruled against the lifeguard was now planning a future with him, and the little girl who had nearly lost her father was now secure in the knowledge that love could overcome any obstacle. The rescue that had brought them together was complete now, not just the physical act of pulling someone from dangerous waters, but the emotional and spiritual rescue of three people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become their best selves. Justice had been served, love had triumphed, and a family had been born from the chaos of crisis and the grace of second chances. As they pulled into the driveway of the life they were building together, Evan realized that the ocean had taught him its most important lesson. Sometimes, the most powerful currents are the ones that bring people together rather than pull them apart. And the most important rescues are the ones that save not just lives, but hearts.